Close your eyes and take a deep breath. Today I invite you into a legend that is far more unsettling than it first appears. Because Arachne's story is not simply about a gifted mortal who challenged a goddess. It carries a sharper, more unusual philosophical edge. It asks whether talent must always bow before authority, whether beauty becomes dangerous when it tells the truth, and whether power fears arrogance or honesty. Beneath the elegance of thread and divine craftsmanship lies a darker question. What happens when art stops decorating power and begins exposing it? This is what makes Arachne's legend feel so striking even now. It is not only a myth about pride, punishment, and transformation, but a haunting reflection on artistic freedom, humiliation, and the cost of creating something too real to be tolerated. As the loom begins to sing and the first threads tighten, you may find yourself wondering whether Arachne was condemned for her defiance, or because her art revealed something even the gods could not bear to see. Before we begin this epic, I have a small request that means a lot to me. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. The greatest reward for all the effort I put into creating these epics is your support through subscribing to my channel. If you enjoy my content and want me to continue creating more, your subscription and like truly give me great motivation. Also, don't forget to share your thoughts with me in the comments. Your comments not only encourage me, but also help me understand what kind of epics and stories you would like to see on this channel. Thank you so much in advance for your support. Take a deep breath, relax your mind, and let the rhythm of this ancient legend guide you. Wishing you a peaceful sleep. The epic of Arachne the mortal who shamed a goddess begins now. Morning in Hypaepa had not opened with light alone, the way mornings did elsewhere. The scent had awakened first, and the day had followed behind it. The cool air drifting down from the slopes of Tmolos had not been enough to scatter the smell of wet wool settled into the narrow streets. The metallic steam rising from the water, heating in copper cauldrons, had mingled with the dry harshness of ash and hung heavily beneath the low roofs. Idmund's house had not differed much in form from the town's other poor houses: mud brick walls, a low ceiling, a narrow window, a half-open door. But anyone who crossed the threshold understood at once that the air inside was not ordinary. The salty, bitter, deep scent of the costly purple dye from Phocaea, mixed with the clean dampness of newly carded fibers, the warm texture of olive-oiled wood, and the ashen breath of the hearth that had gone out in the night. In that house, survival rebuilt itself every day like a silent war. Even so, in the very middle of poverty, an unnamed nobility moved through the rooms. It was as if not only dye, but patience itself had soaked into the walls, as if something longer lasting than bread was being made inside. Idmund had not counted as a great man in town. He had not been one of those whose words were heeded in the agora. The priests did not call him to the front of ceremonies, and the young men of noble houses did not speak his name aloud. His standing had belonged to the kind that settled not on a man's face, but into the work of his hands. The joints of his thick fingers had been hard. The dark stains worked into the base of his nails had not faded for months, and his palms had looked cracked from hot steam and heavy wool. Yet the moment he bent over his work, those hands gained a startling delicacy. Not everyone could use the purple dye that merchants from Phocaea carried with such difficulty. It was one thing to make a color expensive, another to give it dignity. Idmon turned it not into a brightness that shouted all at once, but into a majesty that deepened slowly. He rinsed the wool patiently, let it rest, dipped it into the dye again, and waited for the fibers to draw the color deep inside themselves. Because of that slow discipline in his cauldrons, even a simple cloth, when laid across a shoulder, carried the memory of distant ports and riches hidden away in closed chests. Yet that wealth never clung to Idmon. It merely passed through his hands. In Lydia, as with so many arts, his craft elevated others and left its master in a lowly place. Arachne had grown up in just such a house, between dye and want. Her mother had died quietly long before. The town had not built long sentences around her, and her name had never entered the great narratives. Yet her absence had not stood in the house like a solid emptiness. On the contrary, it had been felt like a second presence that had soaked into everything, in the faint resin scent that rose when the cedar chest was opened, in the pale trace of soap left among carefully wrapped old linens, in the softness of the oil rubbed into the handle of the comb used for carding wool that still had not disappeared. That woman's hand could still be sensed. Arachne had not remembered her mother in long sentences. What remained with her had not been the fixed lines of a face, but a way of doing work. Not rushing when loosening fibers, opening a knot with care rather than fury, meeting the stubbornness of material with patience rather than anger. These had not been the rules of craft her father taught. They had been the silent discipline of a dead mother left behind in the house. Because of that, even as a child, the girl had begun to see wool not merely as raw material, but as a memory that held on to the things that vanished. In her early years, the things that spoke most inside the house had not been people, but scents and sounds. The soft bubbling that broke across the surface of boiling water, the deep rhythm of the shuttle striking the wooden frame, the patient tapping of drops falling from wet skeins onto the stone floor had been like her first lullabies. The things other children memorized as games, Arachne stored in her mind as texture and sound. She could tell apart the animal warmth of newly shorn wool from the heavy dampness of fibers left waiting too long, and she could distinguish the harsh sharpness of dye at the moment it was first dropped into the cauldron from the deeper, settled scent it took on later. Even at that age, her face had begun to carry an unusual attentiveness. The strands of hair falling across her forehead, her large eyes narrowing as she worked, and her mouth, which usually preferred looking over speaking, set her apart from her peers. While her father studied the nature of colors, she also studied the feeling a color left behind in the air. In a piece of cloth, she did not look only for pattern, she also thought about its coolness, its weight, the echo it would give when touched. Her gift had lain not in the skill of her hands alone, but in the way her senses recorded nothing incompletely. The first loops had been born not from some grand claim, but from the scraps that fell to the edge of the house. Short fibers scattered on the floor, fine clippings set aside as useless, little strands whose color had not taken fully gathered before Arachne, and from them she quietly built small surfaces. At first, people had taken them for a child's game, but before long, a strange liveliness appeared inside those surfaces. A vine leaf did not show itself only in shape, but seemed ready to curl under the sun at any moment. A bird's wing did not merely open, but gave the feeling that it had truly split the air. The difference in what the girl did revealed itself here. She did not transfer what she saw exactly as it appeared. but wove the motion and the air hidden inside the visible thing as well. Idmon first wanted to think of it as the natural continuation of his own craft, but as time passed, he had to admit the truth. In his daughter, not only mastery but an independent art of the kind one called Ars had awakened. That girl, born in a small house and carrying no great family name, had seemed unwilling to accept the world as it had been given to her. She pulled it apart fiber by fiber and built it again in the form her own eye had seen. When Arachne truly took her place at the loom, the inside of the house began to change. Until then, the workshop had been the place of dye and labor. Now vision had been added to it. There had been no uncertainty in the way the young girl held the shuttle. Her long, slender fingers neither hurried nor hesitated. The wooden piece moving from one side to the other ceased in her hands to be merely a tool and became something that carried rhythm. In the slight way she leaned her shoulders forward. There had been both a humble attentiveness and a confidence not hidden even from herself. The neighboring women first stopped by to see the cloth being woven. Then they stopped waiting for the finished work. Because Arachne's real enchantment had lain as much in the act of becoming as in the result itself. The brief focus that came over her face as one color approached another, the measured look she passed over the threads before bringing down the comb, the way she concealed a knot as if she were correcting not a flaw, but fate itself, silenced everyone who watched. And so, without anyone quite noticing, the loom turned into a place of performance. Arachne was not only weaving, but also turning the act of weaving itself into something to be witnessed. Her fame first moved in whispers at the doorway, then spread to the market, then out along the roads of Lydia. Even those coming from beyond Hypaepa began to hear that inside that narrow house, a young girl was weaving not cloth, but sight itself. Girls carrying water jars lengthened their way home. Merchants returning from the market lingered on the threshold, and those who came on the pretense of business stayed inside longer than they needed to. Arachne did not shy away from those watching eyes. On the contrary, the more she was watched, the clearer she became. In those days, the sound of the loom became the pulse of the house, the swift passing of the shuttle, the deep echo of the comb striking the threads, the fine tension of the stretched threads, all of it joined together into a music without words. Those watching often could not explain what had seized them. They admired not only the speed of her hands, but the atmosphere the young girl opened around herself as she bent over her work. The one standing there had ceased to be an ordinary craftsman's daughter and had already become a presence that compelled others to watch her. Her beauty had not been showy, but the intensity settled into her face made it difficult for the eye to turn away. It was as if her silence, no less than the loom, deserved to be seen. At last, the mountains heard that silent summons as well. One afternoon, when the sun had grown heavy on the roof tiles, a few young women appeared among those who came to the house, women who were not townsfolk. They seemed to walk upon the earth, yet no dust rose beneath their feet. In their hair there had been the irregular lightness of the wind, and on their skin the cool radiance of spring water. With them, the scent in the room changed as well. Among the dye and the wet wool drifted the fine breath of mountain flowers, the coolness of moss-covered stones, and the damp freshness of shaded groves. No one spoke their names, but everyone understood that they were nymphs descending from Tmolos. When Arachne lifted her head and saw those silent visitors, she neither recoiled nor showed any childish delight. Only her gaze deepened a little more. It was as if she had sensed that the witnesses she had long awaited had finally arrived. On that day, the surface she wove raised up a simple countryside scene, grasses bent by the wind, stones by the water breaking the light, slender shadows walking in the distance. But the nymphs were not looking at the cloth. They were watching how that landscape emerged from Arachne's fingers, because before them there appeared something greater than skill, a power of creation almost neighboring the sacred. As evening fell, the crowd dispersed, but the silence left behind in the room grew heavier still. Idmon stood by the door, his purple-stained hands clasped before him, watching his daughter. On his face there rested not only pride, but also a vague unease that troubled him even more. Until that moment, he had thought of disciplining color as a trade. Now, within his own house, he was seeing labor turn into that more dangerous thing we call art. After Arachne made the final stroke, she did not look at her work as if she had won a victory. She stepped back, watched the evening light moving across the surface, and seemed to listen not to what had been finished, but to what had not yet been woven. The lid of the cedar chest left by her mother stood slightly open, the scent of old linen drifting from within, mixed with the heavy breath of purple dye. For a brief moment, that scent brought together in the same air the forgotten memory of a dead woman and the rising fame of a young girl. While Hypaepa outside sank into the evening cool, the wind carried from Idmon's low doorway not only the smell of dye, but also a name that would not easily be silenced, and passed it over the town: Arachne. After that first evening, Arachne's name no longer remained within the borders of Hypaepa. The wind carried it first through the nearby vineyards, then to the grape-scented slopes of Tmolus, and from there to the cool banks of the Pactolus, where gold dust drifted through the air. The mountain nymphs, who normally took pleasure in watching over the heavy clusters of grapes and hiding the joy of harvest season beneath the shade of the leaves, and the river maidens, who wandered along the shining back of the current and watched the sunlight settle among the pebbles, had their habits disturbed in those days. The vines lost for a while the gaze of those who bent over them. The riverbanks stood empty of naiads combing their hair in the water, for all of them wanted to see what kind of power revealed itself in the hands of a human girl. When they arrived in Hypaepa, they found not an ordinary crowd of curiosity around the small house, but a strange sense of waiting. Inside, the firm sound of the loom rose at intervals, and through the half-open door drifted the smell of dye, damp fiber, and warmed wood. As that scent blended with the cool breath of mountain herbs and the stony brightness of river water, it felt as though different corners of the earth had gathered at the same threshold. Arachne was aware of that growing presence, yet she received it not as a crowd that needed to be welcomed, but as a second atmosphere that had formed naturally around her work. Her posture at the loom was calmer than it had been in the days before. Fame either unsettled a person or quietly enlarged them from within, and in her, it had done the latter. She had gathered her dark hair carelessly and left her wrists bare enough not to hinder their movement. There was neither the excitement of a shy young girl nor the satisfaction of someone hungry for display on her face. She looked rather like someone who understood very well why those watching her were there and had no intention of wasting time on it. As her fingers sorted the fibers, she seemed to separate them not only by their fineness, but by what they would one day become. She set one strand aside for shadow, another for light, and another for a small transition that would not be noticed from afar, but when seen up close would deepen the whole scene. The nymphs and naiads, as they watched her hands, struggled to understand how such measured certainty could live inside a mortal body. For Arachne's movements seemed less learned than remembered, as though she were recalling something very ancient. In time, those who watched began to admit that something enchanting lived not only in her finished cloths, but in the order she created while she worked. The nymphs descending from Tmolus forgot their dances in the shade of the vines and lined themselves up by the door, while the daughters of the Pactolus did not want to leave, even as water still dripped from their hair. One of them whispered that the wool passing through Arachne's hands no longer looked like wool. Another said that in the feathers of the woven birds, the wind itself had been worked in. On the surfaces slowly appearing before the young girl, there was not only shape, there was the weight of harvest, the coolness of the riverbank, and the breaking of noon light upon stone. That was exactly why admiration did not remain pure. When mortals did something very well, they inspired praise. But when a mortal seemed to understand nature itself better than her own spirit, praise called forth another feeling after it, the need for explanation. When something was too beautiful, too fitting, too flawless, it unsettled spirits of nature no less than human beings, and unrest was often the first shadow that followed admiration. That shadow soon found a name. At first it was spoken in a whisper, then it passed between two people like a judgment already confirmed, and at last it became a shared belief settled in nearly everyone's mind. Such a hand could not have existed without the discipline of Athena. The goddess who guarded weaving, guided women's work, and gave form to thought began to be spoken of beside Arachne's name as though she were its natural completion. Athena must have trained her, some said. Others asked, how else could a young girl know such perfect balance on her own? The nymphs formed that judgment with reverence, because to them no great skill was born without a spark broken off from the heavens. The townspeople embraced it with a more earthly ease. In that way it became easier to accept Arachne's rise, while also preserving the safe distance between themselves and the gods. A mortal could be extraordinary, but only if she carried the trace of a god. Otherwise the world would grow too unstable, its boundaries too permeable. Not everyone had yet realized that those words, which some took for praise, were in fact a kind of possession and taming. Arachne had realized it. When Athena's name first reached her ears, she said nothing, and only slowed the motion of the shuttle for a moment. But as the same words were repeated, the silence settling over her face began to harden. To her, this was not praise that lifted her art to the heavens, but an attempt to take from her the most precious thing she possessed: sleepless nights, the pain that gathered in her fingertips, the years spent learning how color and texture ruled one another, the silent discipline left behind by her mother's absence, the heavy air breathed in her father's workshop. All of it was being written into the shadow of a goddess. The more Arachne heard it, the more she felt the need to defend not herself, but the memory of her labor. For to her, the owner of an art was not the power that blessed it, but the will that shaped it. When she straightened slightly before the loom, even the color of her eyes seemed to change. The careful gaze that had worked so intently moments before gave way to a wounded hardness that did not retreat. The nymphs at the doorway could not understand why the air in the room had suddenly turned cold, but everyone sensed that what moved within the young girl was not anger alone, but a deeper objection. At last, someone said it openly, almost with delight. "There is no shame in being Athena's student." The sentence remained in the middle of the room like a clumsy hand that meant to offer praise, but opened a wound instead. Arachne lifted her head. When she spoke, her voice was not loud, yet there was such smooth sharpness in it that the crowd fell silent at once. She said that she was not the goddess's student, and never had been. She explained that no one had taught her where to place her fingers, when colors should draw close to one another, or how far a shadow should be carried. She did not want her art to be shown as a gift granted to her by favor. Favor could be taken back, whereas her own skill had risen from within her very being. As her words continued, the youthful delicacy in her face gave way to a resolve that seemed almost noble. She looked as though she was saying, "Do not write another name over my work." For the first time, the nymphs heard danger in those words. Even the rejection of sentences built from admiration was unsettling in itself. But Arachne's refusal was not merely a correction. It was a claim of ownership. She was declaring that she alone held the right over the origin of her art. Idmon stood in the corner watching his daughter, his hands clasped before him. The expression settling over his face was not only a father's worry, it was as though he understood that a crack he had long sensed had now become visible to the eye. He belonged to a generation that knew one did not compete with the gods. He believed that even great gifts sometimes had to be carried not with a loud voice, but with a bowed head. But Arachne sought no approval, not even in her father's silence. The young girl continued to speak. She said that she did not wish to be exalted through the name of a goddess, that such praise in truth diminished her. For if everyone was going to tie her work to Athena, where, she asked, would her own labor go? Who had stood beside her before calluses rose on her fingers? Who had seen her spend night after night, trying to make the same movement more exact? Who knew that she had filled the silent house left by her mother's absence by speaking into herself? Those questions were not thrown into the air at random. Each of them seemed chosen to disturb the comfort of those standing in the room. A few naiads lowered their eyes. The nymphs of Tmolus gripped their vine leaf crowns without realizing it. For a mortal girl, for the first time, was not only rejecting a divine source, but openly defending the right of creation as something that belonged to herself. After that day, Arachne's loom became not only a place of art, but the center of a conflict of ideas. Those who watched still came, but there was no longer the same peaceful admiration in their gaze. Some began to love her even more, because in her words, they heard the hidden pride of everyone who lived by their labor. Others felt fear deep inside, because every sentence that left Arachne's mouth thinned a little more, the safe boundary people had placed between themselves and the gods. As for the young girl herself, the path back had already closed. She had begun to hear Athena's name no longer merely as a comparison she rejected, but as the first shadow of a rival. When she returned to the loom, her hands did not work more harshly but more clearly, as though she knew she could continue her objection best not by speaking, but by weaving. As evening slowly descended over Hypaepa, the crowd at the door scattered, yet what had been said did not scatter with it. The nymphs returning to Tmolus carried those words among the vines, and the maidens descending to the Pactolus bent over the water and repeated the same sentence. And somewhere in the night, the voice of the young weaver who had refused to count a goddess's name as an honor was heard no longer only in the town, but also in unseen heights. Morning settled heavily over Hypaepa. The sun had risen from behind the mountains, yet the light seemed unwilling to spread openly across the town, slipping instead with hesitation through the thin mist gathered along the slopes of Tmolus. In Idmon's house, the day had begun not with the familiar sounds of work, but with that tense silence that came when work had been delayed. Standing before the loom, Arachne watched the taut stretch of the warp threads, as if she were trying to untangle the knot inside herself before she let her fingers move. The words spoken the day before had not faded from the walls, not because they had been thrown out to belittle Athena's name, but because they had been hurled against the mouths that tried to claim a share of her skill. Those words still seemed to drift through the room. Around the dye vats, the heavy, bitter scent of Phocian purple once again clung to the air. But today, something else had mixed with that familiar smell, the scentless pressure of a judgment drawing near. The nymphs standing near the door did not straighten their leaf crowns, and the river maidens did not laugh as they shook water from their hair. All of them had been drawn into a waiting they did not fully understand, as if even nature itself had taken short, shallow breaths that morning. At that very moment, the measured sound of someone walking with a staff came from the street. It was neither hurried nor uncertain. On the contrary, each strike carried a rhythm that declared the road and the door belonged to her. At first glance, the woman who crossed the threshold resembled one of Lydia's elderly village healers. Her hair was not white, but almost ash-colored, and the strands that slipped down over her face from beneath the cloth wrapped around her head looked like the final traces of a youth long gone. Her waist bent slightly forward, yet that bend gave the sense not of weakness, but of a calculated lowering. Small leather pouches hung from her left arm, and from them rose the scent of dried herbs, sage, and a salve that recalled old medicine cabinets. The staff in her right hand seemed meant not only for support, but for driving her words into the ground. Her eyes undid the entire appearance of old age. They should have been clouded, yet instead they measured every detail in the room with the patience of an inspector. The woman standing in the doorway looked like a counselor or a healer stranded on the road, yet the moment she stepped inside, the air of the house changed. The little workshop suddenly ceased to be a place of family labor and became a narrow chamber where judgment would be set. When the woman began to speak, her voice was not low, nor was it the cracked voice that came from an old throat. It was a voice reined in with refinement, a voice accustomed to command. She addressed Arachne without speaking her name directly. First she spoke of the caution the years had taught, then she explained that the greatest fault of youth was believing too deeply in its own radiance. Her words sounded gentle from the outside, but beneath every sentence lay an order turned in a different direction. Art was praised, yet that praise was immediately tied to a boundary stone. She said that winning fame was no shame, that even being counted the best among mortals could be tolerated. But when it came to the gods, one had to know the proper measure of both hand and tongue. At last, she laid down that short, hard, ancient command: yield to the goddess. As the sentence echoed through the room, everyone felt that this was not a lesson in morality. The woman did not ask Arachne to speak the truth or cleanse her heart. What was demanded of her was that she surrender her claim to the source of her talent and receive in return veniam, that is, forgiveness. This was not pardon. It was a vow of submission. It was not a demand made in the name of art, but in the name of obedience. At that moment, Idmon remained still, without moving the dyed fiber in his hand. The skein he held between his purple-stained fingers suddenly seemed to grow heavier. There was another kind of authority in the old woman's words, one unlike that of town elders, priests, or merchants. It was the kind of power that did not merely make a person unwilling to resist, but made him think about what would happen if he did. The nymphs sensed it as well. Those who had come from the waters of the Pactolus drew close to one another for the first time, as if they longed for the cold of the riverbank. The daughters of Tmolos, without realizing it, clutched their vine-leaf crowns more tightly. For even while the woman gave advice, she was closing a door. The forgiveness she offered seemed like a chance for Arachne to retreat without humiliation, but in truth, it sought to seal, from that very day forward, every word that might later be spoken. If the young girl bowed her head, then every beauty she wove from that moment on would be counted as tribute to the goddess, and every success would be declared the property of the heavens. What had been established in the little world of the workshop was not a scene of council, but a dispute over ownership. And in that dispute, the other side held not law, but almost the habit of the universe itself. Arachne had not moved from where she stood since the speech began. Only the expression on her face changed a little more with each sentence the woman spoke. At first, there had been attentive listening in her gaze. Then, once the true direction of the words became clear, that attention hardened into an icy clarity. In that moment, the young girl did not think of fame or the praise of crowds. She thought first of her hands. She thought of how her fingertips had hardened over the years, of how she had never abandoned the threads even when the oil lamp at night had nearly burned out, of how the few silent habits left behind by her mother had settled into her hands. No one had granted these things to her. The soapy scent that lingered in the cedar chests her mother had left behind, the heavy purple in her father's workshop, the skin split open by winter, the warmth of wet wool in summer, all of it had entered her art from within. And now the old woman standing before her wished to assign that long labor to a higher authority with a single sentence. What stirred Arachne's anger in this was memory before it was pride. For an artist, to lose the source of one's work did not simply mean surrendering pride. It meant handing over the life one had lived into another person's language. That was why, when her lips parted, her rightness was heard before her voice. She set the shuttle on the loom. The wood struck lightly against the warp and gave off a brief sound. Then she straightened. When she rose to her feet, the delicacy of her youth gave way at once to a startling gravity. Arachne took a few steps toward the woman before her. Those steps were neither hurried nor deliberately measured to appear fearless. They were simply as natural as the steps of someone going to defend her own right in her own house. She looked into the old woman's face and spoke without softening her words. My own wisdom was enough for me. The sentences that followed were sharper, more bare. She said that no one had taught her how to weave, that no one had sat beside her through sleepless nights, that leaving her labor beneath the shadow of a goddess would not be honor, but diminishment. Nor did she accept what the woman had offered under the name of veniam. Forgiveness, after all, was given after a crime, and she did not consider herself guilty. In her eyes, the true offenser was the claim that her art belonged to someone else. The crowd shuddered at those words, because Arachne was not merely resisting. She was turning the language of authority back on itself. Where she had been expected to bow, she stood upright. Where forgiveness had been offered, she declared her own acquittal with her own mouth. The old woman fell silent for a moment. This silence did not resemble the hurt silence of an ordinary person. It resembled a great power drawing back its patience. She leaned a little more heavily on her staff, yet though she appeared bent, she did not seem smaller. On the contrary, she reached a measure that felt even more threatening. The veil of age in her eyes seemed to thin, and the gaze beneath it took on a quality that did not listen to human beings, but only judged them. Even so, she did not reveal herself. One final time, as though she were showing mercy, she reminded the young girl that she could still step back. This time her words were barer. If she softened her tongue when speaking the name of a goddess, if she bound herself to her instead of rising above her, what had happened that day might be forgotten. But Arachne understood the very core of that delicate threat. What was being asked was not remorse, but record. From then on, everyone was to write her skill into Athena's account, and she was to make no objection. In that way, the art would survive, but its owner would be erased. A brief shadow of mockery crossed the young girl's face. There was nothing there that resembled fear. There was only the hardening of an intelligence that had seen how humiliating the order offered to her truly was. At that, Arachne closed the final door without raising her voice, but by making it even clearer. If she was truly so great, she asked, then why did she speak through another mouth? If, according to everyone, the skill in her hands bore the mark of divine discipline, then let the owner of that discipline come and say so with her own lips. Arachne no longer looked at the old woman like a counselor, but like the bearer of a shadow. When she said, "Let her not fear to compete with me," everyone in the room heard the nakedness of that sentence. It was not the cry of an anger thrown out wildly. It was a challenge measured, weighed, and spoken to remain forever. Idmon lowered his head slightly. It was plain that he wanted to silence his daughter, yet by then he no longer knew what word could still do any good. The nymphs, for the first time, looked at Arachne not only with admiration, but as though she were a star that brought disaster. For the young girl was no longer merely defending ownership. She was calling divine authority itself onto the stage. The workshop had ceased to be a house and become a boundary line watched closely by unseen heights. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, but it still had not fully entered the house. The light that slipped through the door stretched across the floor in a long line between the old woman's staff and Arachne's loom. Both of them stood on opposite sides of that line, and neither seemed willing to withdraw. The heavy scent of the dye vats mixed with the healing fragrance rising from the herb pouches. Salve and ink, comfort and judgment had knotted together in the same air. Arachne slowly turned back to her loom, but that turn was not surrender. On the contrary, she was preparing to reject the old woman's words not with speech, but with the order of her hand. When her fingers closed once more around the shuttle, everyone in the room understood that this did not resemble an ordinary movement. The old woman's shadow grew on the wall. The staff touched the ground with a light strike. Nothing had been revealed openly, yet everything had changed. What had truly been established in Hypaepa that morning was not only the silence before the contest between two weavers. For the first time, a young girl's insistence on defending her art in her own name and the submission demanded by one of the oldest hierarchies in the universe, had stood face to face in the same room. And now, neither word could be taken back, nor could the shadow step out through the door and leave so easily. Night had not fully withdrawn from above Hypaepa, but the darkness was no longer a veil that ruled everything. It was more like a knot coming undone. Inside Idmund's house, time moved not by the measure of the dawn outside, but by the weight of the breaths being held within. When the old woman's staff struck the ground one last time, that dry sound seemed to echo not only across the stone floor, but in the chest of everyone in the room. Arachne's defiance still lived in the air. The words she had spoken hung between them like an arrow that had been loosed and never called back. Just then, the first light of morning slipped through the crack in the door and fell across the old woman's shoulders, and for a moment every line of her form blurred. Then the uncertainty lifted. Her bent back straightened. The body that had leaned on the staff rejected its own weight, and the weariness that covered her face drew back like mist. The power that had hidden behind ash-colored hair, old coverings, and healer's pouches no longer chose to remain hidden. The workshop's low ceiling seemed lower, its stone floor colder, the air thinner, because what now filled the room was no longer a visitor, but a presence too well known to need its name spoken. When Athena revealed herself, the light in the room resembled neither sunlight nor flame. It was not a light that fell upon things and illuminated them. On the contrary, it was a clarity that seemed to rise from within them and make them more exact than they had been before. The warp threads on the loom no longer looked like ordinary fibers. They seemed to quiver like taut wires. Idmund's copper basins, the combs hanging on the wall, the half-finished skeins, even the dull surface of the cedar chest, all stood within that clarity, more stripped bare, more exposed, more answerable. There was more authority than display in the goddess's form. The cold order of a warrior's majesty, the unshakable mastery of hands that knew their craft. And that sense of measure found in the gaze of a founder of cities wove an invisible armor around her. Her anger did not shout, and for that reason it weighed even more heavily. When she looked at Arachne, her gaze turned not only toward the young woman, but toward the claim she stood behind, toward every sentence that had come from her mouth, toward the right of naming she had placed over her art. Along with a goddess's anger, a goddess's memory had also entered the room. At that appearance, the bodies of those in the workshop decided before their thoughts did. The nymphs who had come down from Tmolus stepped back first, then dropped to their knees all at once. The water maidens of Pactolus bent so low that the wet hair spilling from their shoulders nearly touched the stone floor. The village women crowded at the doorway, and the curious young girls who had come to watch lowered their heads and murmured like people praying, without fully knowing what they were saying. This was not only the movement of fear, it was the gesture of an obedience carved much older and much deeper. It was the kind of submission that would have been called venerantur, both worship and caution, both acceptance and the wish for protection. Even Idmund resisted for a moment, then bowed his head, because the one before him was not only his daughter's rival, but the power whose name human beings had to speak with restraint, even when they talked of skill. Yet in the very center of the room, beside the loom, one person did not bow. Arachne stood with both hands empty, her shoulders tense but unbroken. As everyone around her drew closer to the ground, her figure grew even more distinct, and her shadow stretched alone like the first line of dawn. Fearlessness was sometimes loud. Hers was silent. For that very reason, it looked striking enough to be called non-terita. Even so, Arachne had not turned to stone. The emotions moving across her young face were as swift and visible as the changes dawn made in the sky. In that first instant when she saw the goddess in her true form, a sudden heat rose into her cheeks. In it, there was both the shame of knowing she could no longer take back her anger, and the naked shock that what she had called had truly come. Her face flared for a moment, like the first redness appearing over mountains that faced the east. Then the color withdrew, but this retreat was not the pallor born of fear. It was more like the way a human face made room for something already decided. Just as the sky at daybreak shifted from pink to copper, from copper to pale gold, the expression on Arachne's face changed in that same flow. The heat of a moment before gave way to a calm that could almost have been called hard. Her eyes did not narrow because they could not bear the goddess's light. On the contrary, her gaze grew even clearer within that brightness. It was as if the young woman, without denying her own shame, had made it part not of retreat, but of standing firm. And so two things that rarely remain together stayed on her face at the same time: the flush of a human failing and the cold line of a will that refused to turn back. When Athena saw that stance, she understood that leaving too much room for words was unnecessary. Counsel, warning, an offer of mercy, all that indirect language no longer served any purpose. The challenge had passed beyond the limits of a conversation, disguised by borrowed form. The goddess did not raise her voice, yet everything in the room seemed to shift into place around it. The contest had been accepted. It was not offered as a favor. It felt more like the formal ordering of a judgment that had already begun. At once, the workshop began to function in a different way. Those kneeling by the door were moved slightly back. The skeins were pushed aside, the baskets on the floor were lifted away, and the old textiles resting against the wall were gathered up. The small space opened just enough to allow two wills to work side by side. No one gave orders out loud, yet everyone knew what had to be done. It was as if the goddess's arrival had brought not only bodies but objects themselves into line. Idmund's face had gone ashen, yet his hands moved with the discipline of long habit. He chose the strongest threads set aside for the warp, checked the places where knots lay, and tested whether the loom's legs sat firmly on the ground. He no longer acted like a father, but like a craftsman who could not escape being made an instrument of fate. When the two looms had been set up side by side, the inside of the workshop moved even farther from being a home. One resembled the other, yet neither promised the same thing. The arrangement before Athena gave, at first glance, the feeling of a world that knew its own center. Everything was measured, every tool stood in its proper place, every choice of color seemed like the continuation of some principle settled long before. Before Arachne, however, there was another kind of movement. Order was not absent there, but it was alive, the kind from which deviation and discovery might emerge. As the young woman drew the warp threads tight, her fingers never trembled once. The garment she had gathered up to her chest gave her freedom to work and made the line of her shoulders more distinct. Athena, too, had freed her own arms. There was a military discipline in her movements, while Arachne's carried a quickness that breathed. The shuttles, combs, balls of wool, dyed threads, and pieces of the spinning wheel were lined up side by side like the weapons of two different worlds. After that moment, the contest was no longer something about to begin. It had already begun. For even the setting up of the two looms carried a silent declaration that truth did not wear only one face. One would weave to rule, the other to reveal. As the colors were chosen, dawn kept rising. The light entering through the crack in the door was no longer pale, but full of clarity. Yet the true morning inside the workshop was breaking beside the selected threads. Athena moved her hand across gold and white, then toward a heavier shade of purple, then toward cold blues that recalled the sea. The colors she gathered seemed summoned for the splendor of order. Each thread looked as though it already knew where it belonged. Arachne, after testing the deep purple dyed by her father for a long moment, placed it beside unexpected brightnesses: pale clay, broken green, an almost colorless white that recalled river foam, the warm yellow of stones washed in sunlight. Idmon looked for a moment at what his daughter had chosen and understood that once again she was searching not for what was visible, but for the crack behind what appeared. From where they knelt, the nymphs lifted their heads slightly and watched that silent preparation. No one spoke because even before the first stitch had fallen into the weaving, the chosen colors themselves had already become the language of two different intentions. Before Athena, the world was preparing to wear a crown. Before Arachne, the world was preparing to show the weight of the crown upon it. Then the first movement came. When Athena took the shuttle in her hand, it did not look like a simple gesture of craft. It looked more like the seal of a hand that laid down law. As she passed the thread through the warp, she did not slip for a single moment, nor did she ever move faster than she needed to. In each stroke there was the sense of a city whose center never gave way, of ordered ranks, of measure, of obedience. Arachne, meanwhile, held her own shuttle somewhat differently. It was the same tool in her hand, but the relationship she formed with it was more personal, more instinctive, more defiant. When she passed through the first thread, it was as if she had opened not a fabric, but a surface that would turn into speech. For several breaths, the sound of the looms mingled together. On one side, deep and regular strikes. On the other, a lighter but quicker rhythm. Those two sounds rose side by side in the room, without one overpowering the other. The crowd kneeling at the doorway lowered their heads again, because what they were now witnessing was no longer workshop labor. Dawn had fully broken, and the night had fallen behind. That morning, the small house of Hypaepa belonged not only to mortals and not only to gods. It had become a narrow and irreversible threshold where two different powers began to write separate truths into the same fabric. When Athena's hands began to work, everyone in the room saw for the first time the difference between skill and rule. On Arachne's loom, there had been a living intelligence, a young fire searching for its own path. Before the goddess, there stood not a search, but the unshakable self-assurance of a world already established. The golden threads flowed between her fingers, not like an ordinary material, but like the shining translation of invisible laws that had been in force for centuries. Every stitch seemed to wait for its place, and every color seemed to know, even before it was woven, which authority it would serve. Even the anger on Athena's face did not stand there as a scattered emotion, but as an ordered resolve. It was as if, before defeating her rival, she wanted to show her how the universe worked. That was why what she set before her loom was not merely an answer to a contest. In the face of a mortal girl's audacity, she had begun to declare once more in the language of fabric, upon whom the cosmos rested. In that moment, the workshop did not shrink. On the contrary, it widened like a courtroom, and everyone found themselves before a grandeur that had no explanation, yet was not easy to challenge. At the very first glance, the center of the weaving appeared with the force that drew the entire surface back to itself. Athena had placed the hill of the Areopagus at the heart of the composition. She arranged its stone, its slopes, and its rising sacred weight with such balance that no matter where the eye tried to turn, it returned there in the end. There, the 12 mighty faces of the divine council stood in majestic order. Each one was vivid enough to be distinguished from the others, yet bound to a shared hierarchy that did not allow any of them to shine alone. At the very center stood the chief principle, like the cold core of the council. Around it were the others, silently joining in judgment, and below lay the moment where the great struggle between Athena and Neptune had tightened into a knot. The goddess had placed her own body opposite her rival in such a way that this became not only a scene of victory, but also an image of the legitimacy of victory itself. Neptune's power had not been diminished. On the contrary, it had been shown as strong so that the value of defeat would grow greater. In that way, Athena had been woven not only as the winner, but as one who had won by right. This was the most refined trick of self-glorifying art, to make its rule seem even greater without humiliating the rival. As the eye moved outward from the center, Athena's true intention became even clearer. The composition had been built with a flawless classicism that allowed no trace of disorder. There was no needless excess, nor any passion that might pull the viewer elsewhere. Every figure, every expression, every fold of cloth knew its own boundary. The whole surface repeated a single lesson, a single principle. Athena's art here did not pursue beauty alone. She had created a didactic language that inspired not only admiration, but obedience. The order gathered at the very center of the fabric spread outward in widening rings and silently planted this idea. This was the rightful form of the world. At the center stood divine reason. Around it the beings that bowed to it, and at the outermost edge, the cautionary solitude of those who had forgotten their limits. The entire balance looked not only like an aesthetic choice, but like a moral order. Yet inside that morality, the cold spine of politics remained hidden. For this scene did not separate goodness from beauty, but it placed beauty directly in the service of legitimacy. In that way, anyone who looked at Athena's weaving without realizing it was being invited to admire not only what was beautiful, but also what had prevailed. Even the goddess's choice of colors became part of that lesson. The golden threads did not merely display wealth, they built a shining armor of light that made the center untouchable. Deep purples and cold blues carried both Neptune's power and the grave dignity of the heavenly council without separating them, while the controlled use of white gave the feeling of divine clarity. No tone overwhelmed another, and no transition looked accidental. In Arachne's world, new possibilities were born when colors drew near each other. In Athena's, colors stood side by side to make boundaries more visible. In her fabric, light illuminated not freedom, but authority. The brightness gathered around the thrones, the cool shadow around the faces, the heavy fall of the garments and the firm stance of the silhouettes all said the same thing. There had been no place for chance here. Art did not imitate order itself, It made the permanence of order visible. As the weaving advanced, the surface began to look less like a living world and more like a constitution that would never be broken. It was as if the golden threads were being worked not into fabric, but into memory, being placed once more inside everyone who looked. Power became beautiful when it gathered at the center, and once it became beautiful, it became harder to question. For that reason, Athena's loom was more than a scene from myth. It was turning into an autobiography that wove her own achievements. The goddess did not merely tell of the superiority she had won over Neptune, she also determined the way that superiority had to be remembered. Just as centuries later in other lands, the deeds of a ruler carved into marble inscriptions and presented as the founder of order in the res gestae would be read, Athena's fabric was woven with the same intention. I won because I was right. I stood at the center because the center could not be established without me. There was no humility on this surface, but there was no crude boasting either. There was something more dangerous, a perfect discipline of power that could present its own story as if it were the story of universal order. The goddess placed herself not only as the victor of a contest, but as the natural owner of justice. In that way, personal victory turned into public principle. The defeat of a rival looked like the correct decision made on behalf of the entire cosmos. This was where Athena's true greatness revealed itself. She used her art not only to display herself, but also to govern memory. Even if the onlookers did not fully understand this language, they could not resist its effect. The peasant women kneeling there sensed, as they looked at the growing center of the weaving, that this was not merely beautiful work, yet they could not turn that feeling into words. The nymphs had earlier leaned forward in admiration before Arachne's loom. Now they had drawn back, almost measuring even the use of their gaze. For on Athena's surface, there was not a flow that invited, but a coldness that reminded a person of their place. Yet that coldness was not lifeless. The clarity in the figure's eyes, the grandeur rising around the thrones, and the central will that acknowledged Neptune's strength, yet overcame him, all gave rise to an involuntary surrender inside the viewer. Even Idmon could not keep himself from seeing the technical mastery with which the loom had been built, the invisibility of the knots, the cleanliness of the transitions, and the vitality of the figures, which seemed to rise from the surface, shook his craftsman's mind. But at the same time, he felt something else as well. While looking at this fabric, a person began to use not their own eyes, but the eyes the weaving itself offered them. That was the finest victory of authority. It taught you how to look without forcing you. Arachne, however, read Athena's work in another way. There was no open admiration on the young girl's face, but there was no contempt either. She was not so blind that she would underestimate her rival's power. She saw, one by one, the center the goddess had built, the deliberate balances in the placement of the figures, and the language of authority waiting behind every expression. For a moment, she was left alone with the understanding of why the fabric before her was so effective. Because Athena did not tell the truth, she determined the form in which truth would be remembered. While weaving her own victory, she shaped not only the past, but also the memory of the future. When Arachne realized this, the hard light in her eyes deepened a little more. This weaving was as much a work of art as it was a decree, a triumphal monument, and a silent book of laws. As the young girl looked between the golden threads, she saw not only technical perfection but also a claim of ownership, What Athena was saying was clear. Order came from my hand. Legitimacy was spoken in my name, and even the defeated would be remembered only in the form I chose to tell. What would truly make Arachne rise was precisely this manner of possession. When the weaving advanced a little further, the difference between the two looms became impossible to deny. Athena's surface was completing itself, like a perfect sphere closed within itself. It asked for nothing from outside, and recognized no authority other than its own center. For that reason, every line there was a conclusion, every form was a decision, and every figure knew its task. In Arachne's gaze, however, another world that had not yet been woven still trembled. The hierarchy the goddess had built stirred in the young girl not fear, but another thought entirely. If power could justify itself so beautifully through art, then the duty of art could not be only to create what was beautiful, but also to make that justification visible. Inside the workshop, morning had long since turned into full day, yet the golden order rising from Athena's loom still drew every eye to itself like the first harsh light of dawn. Even before the fabric had been completed, it had already delivered its teaching. And under the silent weight of that teaching, Arachne's hands moved slowly toward her own threads, because now she understood that her turn was not only to answer, but to reveal the crack hidden behind this magnificent order. After Athena established her own victory at the center and sealed it with golden certainty, she moved to the most insidious part of the weaving, the edges. For power did not remain standing by shining only at the center. It also drew boundaries around itself, teaching the eye how far it was allowed to go and where it had to turn back. As the goddess's fingers opened new scenes around that flawless center, the air in the room changed. The gazes that had just been stretched tight with admiration now began to narrow with an unease they could not explain. On Athena's face, the cold satisfaction of a rightful triumph over Neptune still remained, but as she worked the edges, something else joined that satisfaction, the will to instruct. Yet this was not the open and generous teaching of wisdom. This was a darker language, one by which sovereignty guarded its own boundaries through cautionary tales. At the center, she had said, here was order. At the corners, she would say, this was the end of anyone who rose against that order. In that way, the weaving began to produce a second law hidden inside beauty. The whole surface now carried not only divine splendor, but also the price of objecting to that splendor. In the first corner, Rhodope and Hermes appeared. Athena did not shape them as great criminals, but as two mortals whose arrogance had settled into their faces. That made the scene even more powerful. For the goddess chose to punish not open wickedness, but the upward reach that forgot its limits. In the posture of the young husband and wife, one could read that dangerous intoxication that led human beings to want to resemble the gods, the empty pride of those who gave themselves divine names and measured their union against the heavens. Yet Athena did not make them ugly in order to diminish them. On the contrary, she showed them on the threshold of the very moment of transformation, with faces that still carried human warmth. In that way, the coldness of petrification became even more striking. Their shoulders grew heavier, and as their words fell silent, the earth around them turned into their bodies. In Rhodope's gaze, there was one last denial, and in Hermes's neck, one last rigidity. Then both of them turned into mountains that would outlive their human names. This scene had not been woven to mock, but to unsettle. Athena's message was clear. Whoever enlarged themselves too loudly in the end lost their voice and became a geography. Their existence remained, but their will was erased. In another corner, the story of the pygmy queen rose up. This scene was more active than the others, yet even within that movement there was a merciless order. The queen of the small-bodied people had once walked in splendor among her own circle, and despite the lightness of her name, she must have believed her rule carried weight. Athena showed her not at the exact moment of collapse, but at the recognizable threshold of collapse. She was still a queen, but estrangement had already begun around her face. Her arms opened as if preserving grace, yet that movement ceased to be a human gesture and became the first sign of a bird's wing. Her neck lengthened, and her voice gave way to a shrill and restless emptiness. The figures around her could not be clearly identified, whether they were her former subjects or the heralds of her new fate, and Athena seemed to have left it that way on purpose. For in this scene, it was not punishment, but the feeling of diminishment that did the work. One who had once ruled finally became a drifting shadow, estranged even from her own kind. In this corner of the weaving, the warning did not arrive like an open blow, but as a politics of reduction that sank into the human soul. The goddess was not merely saying to her rival, "You would be defeated." She was saying, "You would become unrecognizable." As Athena filled the corners, everyone in the workshop began to understand that the true target of the weaving was Arachne. Rhodope and Haemus were not merely an old myth. The pygmy queen was not simply a forgotten story standing on its own. All of them were turned in the same direction. Without speaking, the goddess spoke. By staging scenes, she threatened. There was a look inside this work that said, "Look at these examples and learn." And that message resembled a court proclamation far more than a call for mercy. What was displayed before Arachne did not feel like random warnings from the past, but like selected case files. Each one told in a different form what could happen to a mortal the moment that mortal pushed too far. Petrification, diminishment, the loss of human form, the surrender of one's name to geography or to the cry of a bird. In that way, Athena turned a naked threat into something aesthetic through the art of weaving. The threat was neither as crude as a sword nor as fleeting as words. Because it was placed inside art, it became both beautiful and permanent. The nymphs understood this language at once. The fact that they did not dare lift their heads from where they had knelt came not only from respect for the goddess, but also from the knowledge that they could read a lesson for themselves in those corners. Arachne, however, understood very early that she herself was the one being threatened, though it was not clear whether that produced the effect Athena expected. As the young woman's eyes moved from corner to corner, not fear but an intense concentration settled over her face. She did not deny how great an artist Athena was. On the contrary, she knew that she herself was the one who best understood the goddess's mastery. But that understanding did not lead her to surrender, for what she saw was not only technical perfection, but perfection being used for threat. The order at the center had now turned into punishment at the corners, and divine authority had built a geography of fear through beauty. Arachne understood that this geography had not been drawn at random, and that each example carried its own sentence. Art did not merely tell stories, it also forced others into line. In that moment, there was not a shy hesitation in the young woman's gaze. but the hardening cold of thought. She saw the ends of those who had come before her, yet she used that not to retreat, but to see more clearly the true nature of the power before her. Athena was not treating her merely as a rival. She wanted to turn her into the final example in a public file of warning. That was what silently made Arachne stand even straighter. When Athena reached the outermost line of the weaving, she surrounded that map of fear with one of the oldest symbols of peace, olive branches. Fine silver leaves began to circle the entire work with a calm and almost consoling rhythm. At first glance, that frame seemed to complete the divine order at the center with serenity, and to bind the cautionary scenes in the corners to a higher sense of harmony. Yet anyone who looked carefully could feel that this piece was not warm, but cold. Athena's olive was less a gift that spread peace than a sign of sovereignty, declaring, "This was the silence I established." The silver gleam of the leaves did not soften the disasters in the corners. On the contrary, it turned them into the natural extension of an accepted order. Thus peace appeared not as the end of conflict, but as a state in which disobedience had already been crushed in advance. As the goddess scattered olive branches around the work, it was as if she said this: "In my world there was calm because everyone knew their place. For that reason, the elegance of the frame became the finest veil, hiding the threat within it." Here again, beauty became the language not of mercy but of control. When the village women in the workshop saw the olive branches, they first wanted to feel relief, because the olive was a reassuring sign familiar to everyone who worked the land. But that sense of safety did not last. Once the branches joined the stories of transformation in the corners, the feeling the frame gave began to change. This was not a forgiving peace, but a stillness in which resistance had already been made meaningless. Even Idmon sensed that. Looking at it with the mind of a craftsman, he saw that the frame created an extraordinary balance that completed the composition, but looking at it with the heart of a father, he also understood that this graceful boundary was an invisible ring drawn around his daughter. The whispers among the nymphs were brief, because none of them could openly speak against Athena's work. Even before finishing her weaving, the goddess had already taken command of the atmosphere. Now everyone felt not only what she had done, but also what she meant, and that meaning was political far more than poetic. Authority was powerful enough to silence the voice that threatened it without using a sword. A gallery of warnings, a few mythological examples, a few gleaming olive leaves. Once they came together, they created a complete order of intimidation established without naked force. By the time she reached the final touches, there was no fatigue on Athena's face, only the calm of one who knew her method had worked perfectly. When she passed the shuttle one last time, the sound that came from the loom did not resemble doors closing, but choices narrowing. At the center stood the golden order of the Areopagus, in the corners the diminished ends of proud mortals, and at the outer edge the shining stillness of olive branches. When the whole work was complete, what emerged was not merely a surface flawless in aesthetic terms. It was a geography of fear built from beginning to end, a world that inspired awe while pulling one back at the same time, turning beauty into an instrument of suppression. With her weaving, Athena had not shouted at her rival, humiliated her, or hurled an open curse. She had done something far more effective. She had shown examples, and the language of those examples was clear. If you accepted divine order, you lived beneath the shade of the olive. but if you resisted, your name turned into a cautionary corner. As Arachne watched this from before her own loom, she now fully understood that the contest was no longer only a matter of who wove better. The question of in whose hands art concealed the truth and in whose hands it revealed it, quietly but irreversibly took its place in the room. Athena's weaving had built a world that closed outward from its golden center. Arachne, by contrast, scattered the very idea of a center from the first moment she opened her own surface. On her loom, no figure sat like a sacred sun that bound everything else to itself. The scenes flowed into one another, one wave blending into the shore of the next image, one gaze turning into the silent cry of another story. This was not disorder. On the contrary, it was the form that best suited suppressed truth. For Arachne was weaving not the splendor of the gods, but the shadows they left behind. As she passed her thread through the opened strands, her face held none of the excitement of an artist seeking admiration. It carried something harder, colder, almost like the expression of a witness. As purple, leaden blue, broken white, and pale strands like sea foam came together in her hands, what emerged began to look less like a procession of myths and more like a ledger of exposure. Arachne was preparing to make visible not the power of the heavens, but power's habit of changing its disguise, not the reverence that circled divine names, but the deceit hidden beneath that reverence. The first great scene opened with Europa, and everyone in the workshop understood within only a few stitches that this did not resemble Athena's didactic monument. When Arachne wove Zeus in the form of a bull, the animal stood there not like a figure worked into cloth, but like a living being with real warm breath. The whiteness across its shoulders shifted as the light touched it. Beneath its muscles, a slow and reassuring strength seemed to move. The shore beneath its feet hovered in a thin hesitation between water and stone. The waves were woven so convincingly that for a moment one might have believed they would spill over the edge of the loom. But Arachne's true genius lay not in making the bull seem alive, but in transforming Europa's place within that scene. The young woman did not appear either as a prize or as some insignificant figure waiting for a name in the games of the gods. As she placed her hand on the animal's back, the brief softness that resembled trust and the faint inner shiver of unease existed on her face at the same time. That was precisely why the scene told not the noise of an abduction, but the elegance of a trap. It showed that the most dangerous form of deception first appeared in the shape of safety. After Europa, the surface widened through the long and wearying passage of Zeus divided into other disguises. Here Arachne did not create a single moment of wrongdoing. Instead, she showed the same power resorting to the same trick again and again while wearing different faces. In one place there was the bull. Elsewhere golden rain appeared, falling silently over heavy curtains and tower chambers. A little farther on, near meadows and hunting paths, the silhouette of a satyr moved about wearing the mask of cheerful rustic life. In Athena's weaving, forms served order. On Arachne's surface, disguise itself had turned into a document of crime. Zeus looked different in every scene, yet the same possessive coolness inside his gaze never changed. The power of the gods here was defined not by lightning or a crown, but by the privilege of entering another person's world without permission. As Arachne showed this, she never once took refuge in crude anger. Her art achieved exposure not by shouting, but by making the terror of repetition visible. A bull, a rain, a creature of the countryside. The forms changed, but the will remained the same. In that way, the onlookers saw for the first time that behind divine multiplicity stood a single moral habit, disguise in order to approach, deception in order to take. In the scene of Danae, the air of the workshop changed completely. Arachne did not shape that young woman, shut away in her tower, as a beauty viewed from the outside, but as a state of loneliness drawn inward upon itself. The stone surfaces around her were cool. Even the light that came through the window stood there not as a refuge, but as a delicate sign of inaccessibility. Then the golden rain descended, but it was not the radiant, sacred blessing Athena would have chosen. In Arachne's hands, gold ceased to be the shining symbol of wealth and divine chosenness, and became a fluid trick used to pierce a boundary. The strands had been placed so skillfully that the viewer, the moment they were caught by the beauty of the rain, also felt the violation it created. Danae's face was the true center here. She had lifted her head, but not in wonder. She had done so in surprise, with the alertness of someone trying to understand, with the face of a person sensing that the world enclosed within her was being silently disturbed from above. Arachne's great courage lay exactly here. She had woven divine approach not in the language of a gift, but in the language of an intrusion that crossed beyond a woman's consent. In that way, gold became for the first time not a sign of wealth, but a symbol of the power to cross into privacy without paying for it. In another flow later appeared, but Arachne did not leave this scene either inside the soft mist beloved by the ancient poets. The swan had been formed with such beauty, with the grace of its neck and the nearly touchable brightness of its feathers, that the gaze was inevitably drawn to it first. Yet beauty here carried no innocence. In the whiteness of the swan, there was a closeness too perfect, a softness too calculated. Leda's hands were not caught in a hard push, rejecting the approaching presence, but neither did they carry a looseness that fully accepted it. Arachne had mastered precisely this in-between place. The disaster of women often began not with noise, but by leaving them suspended between trust and unease, unable even to fully name what was happening to them. Leda's face was held at that brief threshold where amazement and the desire to pull away existed at the same time. That was why the scene ceased to be a pastoral meeting for the outside observer and became, when viewed from within, a disturbing uncertainty. Arachne was weaving not the swan's wing, but the way a woman's right to decide was blurred. The crime of the sky sometimes began exactly there, not with open force, but where a person was pushed into doubting her own feeling. When she came to Antiope, the young weaver created an even darker clarity. In the scene she placed beside meadows and hunting paths, the satyr's disguise did not appear merely as a playful, rustic mask. Behind that mask, there was a calculated approach, hiding beneath the guise of cheer and looseness. Arachne worked the shadows of the trees and the grass at the foot of the rocks so delicately that the scene at first opened like a peaceful pastoral world. But that peace did not last. In Antiope's posture there was not defenselessness, but a trust in the world that had not yet been betrayed. That was precisely why the deceit around her felt heavier. Arachne did not diminish her with the language of victimhood. She gave the young woman's shoulders, the line of her face, and the calm relationship she had with the nature around her, such dignity that the weight of the violation grew even greater. What happened here was not simply a god approaching a mortal woman. It was the openness offered by nature, being corrupted by masked power. The satyr silhouette, which should have represented rustic joy, instead appeared like a shadow that instrumentalized trust. In that way, Arachne showed that crime hid not only in the heavens, but in the roles the heavens chose when they descended to earth. What bound all these scenes together was that Arachne had finally cast the gods down from the center. Athena, in her own weaving, had established the order of the divine gaze. Arachne had turned that gaze downward and placed it upon the women's faces, hands, shoulders, and silences. Europa's hesitation, Danae's careful astonishment as she looked upward, Leda's blurring boundary, Antiope's unbroken but defenseless dignity. When all of these came together, what emerged was not the adventure of the gods, but the truth of the women forced to encounter them. When those in the workshop realized this for the first time, even the sound of the loom seemed to change. In Athena's work, the nymphs had seen a cold order that drew them into line. Now, on Arachne's surface, the inner world of women they had heard named only in songs was opening before them. This reversed the direction of art. Myth no longer told how the powerful won. It asked whom the powerful had silenced within their own tale of victory. And Arachne's great audacity lay precisely in this. She made the gods remembered for the first time, not in the form they told of themselves, but in the silent memory of those harmed by them. While Athena's golden threads wove legitimacy, Arachne's strands unraveled memory. As the cloth drew closer to completion, the difference between the two works ceased to be merely a difference of subject. It became two separate ways of knowing the world. In one, there was order, but no voice for those cast outside that order. In the other, there was a flow that seemed scattered, but within that flow, the full moral weight of what had been suppressed gathered itself. On Arachne's loom, no scene served the majesty of the gods. Each one made visible the price of that majesty. And she did not do this by making anything ugly. That was the most shattering part. The bull was beautiful. The rain was beautiful. The swan was beautiful. The shadow of the countryside was beautiful. But the intention hidden within that beauty could no longer remain hidden. Arachne proved that the true power of art was born precisely here, not merely in imitating what was seen, but in separating the lie within what appeared. Throughout her weaving, the words Caelestia, Crimina were never written, yet every part of the surface whispered the same thing. The crimes of the sky grew heaviest when they presented themselves as blessings. When the final stitches fell into place, no one in the workshop spoke at once, for the world Arachne had built before them was not only an accusation against the gods, but also an assault against the habit of seeing itself. For years, people had listened to the same stories and taken the bull for adventure, the rain for miracle, the swan for beauty, the rustic mask for play. Now those same scenes, viewed through an entirely different language, revealed the hardness inside them. When Arachne stood before her loom, there was no cry of triumph on her face, because what she had made was not a spectacle adorned for victory, but an utterance that could never be taken back. Athena's weaving said, "Look and obey." Arachne's had begun to say, "Look and finally see." That was why the fate of the contest would be decided not only by skill, but by which work carved itself more deeply into memory. That morning in the small house in Hypaepa, a young girl had done more than build scenes with thread. She had also opened the first great tear in the veil of reverence woven around the gods. After Arachne had made the gods' shape-shifting crimes visible one by one, she paused for a brief moment before the loom. It did not look like the pause of a tired craftswoman catching her breath, but like the silent weighing of an artist, deciding in what language her work would speak its final word. Athena had closed her own weaving from the center outward, sealing her golden order with the cool authority of olive branches. But when the young weaver reached the edge, she did not want to close it. She wanted it to open. As her fingers moved across the threads she had chosen last, she suddenly settled on colors that were lighter, livelier, and freer. The green of fresh leaves, the fragile pink of newly opened flowers, the young shade of a stalk that had not yet yellowed, the pale white that flashed for a brief moment on morning dew. Then, with those colors, she began to weave the ivy that had wound around poets' heads and had been thought as supple and self-willed as poetry itself. This was not an ornament. It was the signature she placed in silence. For in Athena's world, the border had been the final line of order. But in Arachne's world, even the frame had turned into a living will that grew, hung down, and carried its own form beyond itself. Even with its first leaf, the ivy did not resemble the goddess's olive. The olive had been dignified. It had carried a noble, cool, measured calm. The ivy, however, had refused to appear obedient. As Arachne set it along the edge of the loom, she did not arrange its leaves at neat intervals. She let one overlap another slightly, then bent a slender tendril from an unexpected direction, then stretched a bud outward as if it were about to spill beyond the frame. In that way, the border ceased to be a line that marked a limit. It turned into a green breath that joined the work's own overflowing life. When the nymphs in the workshop saw this, they glanced at one another without meaning to. They knew the nature of ivy well from the wild. It was not taught by a wall, it did not ask permission from a tree, and wherever it clung, it changed that place according to its own rhythm. That was exactly what Arachne had chosen. Athena's authority had said through the olive, "Peace rests with me." But the young girl's ivy had quietly said, "Art belongs to no one." In the way the leaves wound around one another, there had been not the gratitude of a student to a teacher, but the stubbornness of a poet carrying her own voice on her own breath. The flowers opened beside that stubbornness as a soft but unyielding witness. As the whole weaving took on a new meaning through the ivy, the world Arachne had built began to separate itself from Athena's with greater clarity. In the goddess's work, the center had called everything back to itself. No matter how far the eye wandered, it returned in the end to that golden core where judgment had been pronounced. But in Arachne's world, the eye was not forced to rest. It was invited to wander. The transitions from Europa's shore to Danae's stone chamber, from there to that blurred threshold by the water where Leda stood, and from there to Antiope beneath the shadow of the countryside, mingled with one another like a deliberate whirlpool. The foam of one wave touched the gleam of golden flow in another scene. The hesitation resting on one woman's shoulder joined itself to the inner voice in another face's astonishment. This scattering was not disorder. On the contrary, Arachne was establishing the true movement of life precisely within what seemed scattered. Truth, after all, did not usually line itself up before a throne. It collided, seeped, overlapped, and reappeared from an unexpected place. The young girl's loom had known that. In her art, scenes were not merely shown, they gave birth to one another. That was why every new figure, instead of completing the one before it, began to question it all over again. Athena's weaving had been flawless. One would have had to be blind to deny it. But Arachne was now showing that flawlessness was sometimes achieved at the cost of freezing life itself. On the goddess's surface, everything had stood in its proper place. The figures had been exactly where they should have been, as radiant as they should have been, as instructive as they should have been. That beauty gave reassurance to the viewer, because it allowed nothing to spill beyond the frame. Arachne, however, broke that very feeling of safety. In her weaving, just when one scene seemed to have ended, the echo of another continued. Just when one image seemed left in the past, it returned more vividly in another corner. That liveliness resembled the soul of the young girl at the loom, a soul that could not be forced into line, but was never random. Her fingers worked the shuttle with such speed and such instinct that those watching had difficulty telling where the thread ended and where the image began. It was as though Athena had taught the imitation of the world, while Arachne had chosen to bring a new world to birth from inside the cloth. That was why her loom began to look not like a narrative surface, but like a second nature that breathed. The difference between truth and imitation showed itself most clearly on water and skin. Athena had arranged her olive tree, her divine assembly, and her moment of victory so neatly that they stood with the perfection of a legal text. But the waves on Arachne's shore of Europa did not merely resemble water. They called forth the cold of water itself. The bull's hide did not merely look white. It seemed as though if one reached out a hand, it would leave living warmth in the palm. The gold descending to Danae did not merely shine, it truly pierced the silence of a closed chamber. That was what most unsettled those in the workshop. When one looked at Athena's art, one saw order. When one looked at Arachne's, one felt as though one were drawing near to reality itself. There had been danger in that nearness, because once reality had been felt, the safe distance of symbols was broken. The young weaver was doing this knowingly. She was not merely saying, "Look, these things happened." She was saying, "Feel how these things were lived." In that way, the gulf between imitation and verum was laid bare for the first time. In one, authority had wanted to appear. In the other, life had been forced into view. As the ivy advanced, the edge of Arachne's work began to speak as much as its center. Thin tendrils wound themselves around flowers, and the flowers opened an unexpected freshness around the dark scenes. That contrast had not been chosen at random. The young girl did not want to cover a surface filled with the gods' crimes in gloom, because the world she told did not carry only what had been wounded, but also the life that endured despite the wound. That was why the colors of the flowers were not too innocent. In the curve of a leaf there had been defiance. In the delicate petal of a flower there had been a life that did not retreat. Athena had said with the olive, "If you obey, you will find peace." Arachne, with flower and ivy, was drawing close to saying, "Even if truth hurts, life still puts forth shoots." This had been the mortal answer of an art that was biological, poetic, and self-willed against the goddess's political peace. It was no accident that Ivy, considered the crown of poets, had been placed there. Arachne no longer looked like only a weaver, but like someone who thought with thread, spoke with fiber, and established her own aesthetic law with her own hand. The frame had ceased to be the boundary of a craft, and had turned into the green declaration of independence. As the nymphs and naiads watched those final touches, they shivered openly for the first time. In Athena's work, fear had come with a divine weight that forced a person to step back. But in Arachne's weaving, wonder arose from a reality that came too close. The water maidens from the Pactolus thought they truly felt moisture on their skin as they looked at the waves surrounding Europa. When the nymphs of Tmolus saw that the ivy leaves resembled not cloth, but living shoots grown on their own mountains, they understood that this work had now gone beyond the boundary of imitation. Some turned their eyes toward Athena, because this autonomous world unfolding in the young girl's hands was not only beautiful, but was also shaking the singular claim of divine art. And Idmon, in the corner, stood with his purple-stained hands clasped, looking at his daughter's loom in such a way that pride and the knowledge of disaster were mingled on his face. He understood better than anyone what Arachne was doing. His daughter was not merely weaving well, but answering with her own life the question of to whom art belonged. And that answer was as stubborn as the ivy branches on the loom, and as irreversible as the place to which they had clung. The difference between Athena and Arachne could no longer be seen merely as the difference in style between two rivals. On one side there had been order, flawless, calculated, central, and instructive. On the other there rose an art that resembled the flow of life itself, curling, spilling over, blending scenes into one another, depriving the gaze of a safe line. The goddess's world had carried the kind of clarity power loved. Everything yielded its meaning at once, and each figure presented the lesson expected from it. But Arachne's world demanded labor from the viewer. It forced that viewer to think not only about what had happened, but about how it had felt, what it had concealed, and what silence it had compelled into speech. That was why the young girl's art had not been less orderly, but more dangerous. Order loved the order that resembled itself, but truth, even when it seemed shapeless, seized a person more deeply. Arachne had sensed that secret. With each forward flight of her shuttle, she set her own verum against Athena's world of simulat, and she did not merely weave the cloth, but almost forced it to bear witness. No one yet fully knew the price of that witness, but everyone felt that it would be very heavy. When the last flower settled into place, such a silence fell over the workshop that one could have forgotten even the morning outside. Arachne drew her hands back from the loom, but she did not step away. The work before her was not merely a surface telling of the gods' crimes. It was an oath of independent art, written against the divine ownership of narrative that had been built over those crimes. The ivy at the edges did not sit there meekly. It looked alive, as if it were about to keep growing. The flowers whispered of a life that had not gone out, even around scenes of fear. Europa's waves still seemed as if they were about to strike the shore. Danae's chamber still seemed to hold that silent violation seeping down from above. Leda's gaze still seemed to be trying to name what she had felt. Athena's weaving had become the image of a world that had completed its judgment. Arachne's, however, resembled a truth that refused to close even at the moment it was completed. That was why the outcome of the contest, no longer fit within the question of who had woven more beautifully. In that small house, the truly frightening thing now was that for the first time a mortal girl seemed to have stripped not only the gods, but art itself from being their property. When Arachne set the final stitch into place, time in Idmond's low-ceilinged workshop seemed to stop for a moment. The last sound of the shuttle touching the loom hung in the air, not like the sign of a finished task, but like the mark of a truth that could no longer be taken back. The young woman stepped back once, yet she did not move away from her work. The weariness of long labor rested on her shoulders, while on her face there remained a calm and severe clarity that rose above that exhaustion. The waves foaming along Europa's shore, the gold slipping into Danae's sealed chamber, the unease on Leda's face that no name could fully hold, Antiope's unbroken dignity, and the wild vitality of the ivy winding around all of it, stood before them not as separate things but as different echoes of the same breath. There was no longer only one story in that cloth. There was an exposed order, an art that had borne witness, and a hand that owed itself to no one. That was why the first silence weighed far more heavily than admiration, and everyone in the room had to look within themselves before they could say a single word. The village women, the water nymphs from the Pactolus, and the nature spirits who had come down from the vine-scented slopes of Tmolus slowly lifted their heads and looked at the work. None of them had dared speak first, because they sensed they stood before a surface so powerful that calling it beautiful would not have been enough. The eye that searched for a flaw in Arachne's weaving soon found itself occupied less with imperfection than with life itself. The bull's hide did not merely look white, it truly seemed warm and breathing. The waves were not simply woven, they called up the coolness a person felt around the ankles. The golden rain did not merely shine, it grew heavy like a silent force entering a room without permission. In that moment, even envy, that ancient and dark feeling that fed on another's success, could not find a breach in this work. The perfection raised before Arachne's loom stood so plainly that it made even praise seem unnecessary. For sometimes a work became so complete that even the jealous gaze, the first tool used to oppose it, was left empty-handed. When Athena slowly walked through that silent admiration toward Arachne's work, the air in the room changed again. There was no haste in that walk, and none of the blindness of rage. Athena looked first with the eye of a master. She tested one by one the transitions of water in Europa's scene, the subtle movement between light and shadow on the bull's shoulder, the tension created in Danae's chamber by the gold without touching the walls, and the way the ivy along the edges enlarged and quickened the lines rather than breaking them. That gaze ceased to be the gaze of a scornful goddess and became, whether she wished it or not, the gaze of a great artist forced to take another artist seriously. She searched for a flaw, yes, yet the fact that the flaw she sought did not exist grew heavier with every passing moment of that examination. For what Arachne had done was not merely a fine imitation. Athena understood that before her stood a truth that had moved beyond imitation. This weaving did not copy what was visible, it carried onto the loom the feeling, the fear, and the violation that lay behind what was seen. That was exactly what lengthened the goddess's silence. There was no outward change on Athena's face that an ordinary observer would have read at once. Her lips remained measured, her neck remained upright, and her shoulders still carried their divine dignity. But someone who looked carefully at her face could have understood that something had broken from the way her eyes returned twice to the same places, from the way they lingered a little too long over a passage, and from the disappearance of the easy certainty she carried when she looked upon her own work in the presence of this surface. This was not the beginning of ordinary anger. It was something deeper, colder, and more wounding. Arachne's success had not only damaged Athena's pride. The world the young woman had built with mortal hands visibly shook for the first time the goddess's claim to a natural supremacy over art. If a mortal could stand before the goddess in flawless strength, and beyond that, weave truth in a barer form, then what had been wounded was not merely the outcome of a contest. The wound reached all the way to the question of whom art belonged to and whose voice was naturally accepted as greater. Idmon stood in the corner, his hands stained with purple pressed tightly together. The pride rising within him as a father came from seeing the labor their poor house had carried for so many years reach such a brilliant height. Yet at the same time his heart tightened because he sensed what Athena's silence was becoming. Great powers sometimes met defeat not with a cry, but with a hardness born from silence. When he looked at Arachne's work, he did not see only his daughter's skill there. He also saw the trace of the patience her dead mother had left behind in the house, the discipline of the heavy purple from his own workshop, and that stubborn attentiveness that had grown out of years of poverty. Now all of that had turned into a value the goddess herself had been forced to recognize, but that recognition brought no peace. Even the nymphs understood it. The eyes that had just moments earlier gazed in admiration at Arachne's ivy, and her waves now withdrew when they saw the deepening cold in Athena's gaze. For if even envy had found no flaw, then what would enter next would no longer be an aesthetic judgment alone. Arachne carefully watched the difference between the moments when Athena looked at her own work and the moments when she looked at Arachne's weaving. There was neither childish delight nor overflowing triumph on the young woman's face. She understood what the goddess saw. Perhaps she understood it better than anyone else in the room. One master recognized from another master's gaze what that other had been forced to admit. Athena could no longer look down on her. That was Arachne's true victory. It did not lie in receiving open praise, but in forcing the goddess before her into equality through silence. That was why the young woman's shoulders did not rise any higher, and her gaze gained no more insolent gleam. On the contrary, a grave but clean stillness settled over her face. She knew that her art could no longer be written into someone else's shadow, and that her labor could no longer be diminished as though it were some divine gift. For that moment she had proved it. For a mortal there was no greater confirmation than that. And yet she did not deny the danger that came with such confirmation, because being acknowledged was one thing, and being forgiven was another. The pain growing within Athena might not have resembled anger from the outside, but it was something heavier. She did not doubt the splendor of her own work. The Areopagus still stood before her as the flawless image of order and divine authority, and the olive branches still bore the cold sign of a peace under control. But Arachne's weaving had placed a new measure beside that splendor. For the first time, Athena had been forced to see that her own art, however flawless, did not say everything, did not cover everything, and could not carry the whole weight of truth. That was what wounded her most deeply. For defeat sometimes arose not from technical weakness, but from the moral opening created by one's rival. Arachne was not stronger than the goddess, but she had brought to the center the voices pushed outside the order the goddess had built. For Athena, that was something beyond humiliation. A young mortal girl had made the limit of her art visible. In such moments, both human and god felt the same wound, the deep ache born when another's success made one's own completeness appear lacking. As the silence in the workshop stretched on, it almost became something that could be heard. No one expected praise from Athena anymore, yet everyone tried to understand the judgment carried in her gaze. That judgment had not yet been spoken, but it was already there. There was no technical flaw in Arachne's work. Even envy could not find a single mistake to pick from that weaving, not a weakness as small as the point of a needle, not the slightest trembling hidden in a knot. That was why the air inside the workshop grew heavier, for the absence of flaw left behind only naked truth. Arachne stood beside her loom, breathing calmly like someone who defended the world she had built with her own hands. Athena, meanwhile, felt from within her own greatness how unbearable that calmness was. This silent judgment, delivered inside a poor house among the smell of dye-soaked boards and wet wool, did not merely decide the outcome of a contest that morning. It showed that before art, even divine privilege itself could be made to stop and give an account, if only for a moment. And that was precisely why what had been accepted in silence was as dangerous as victory itself. The silence of perfection in the workshop did not last very long. In that moment, which even envy could not sink its teeth into, two feelings settled into everyone at once: admiration and the heavy knowledge of an approaching disaster. Athena stood before Arachne's work for several breaths without speaking at all, but this silence no longer belonged to an artist making an assessment. It belonged to a power that had found its own authority wounded on the surface of a fabric. As her eyes moved across Europa's living waves, that silent golden violation slipping into Danae's chamber, the blurred border around Lydia, and the unbroken dignity of Antiope, she understood more deeply that the weaving before her was not only beautiful, but unforgivable. Because Arachne had not insulted the gods here in some crude language, she had done something more dangerous than that. She had made them visible outside their own glory, inside the memory of those who had been harmed by them. Sometimes the thing power tolerated least was not insult, but truth shown from the right place. That was why the harsh redness settling over Athena's face grew heavier even beyond technical defeat. When the goddess could find no flaw in her rival's art, she turned toward attacking that art's right to exist. The movement came so suddenly that the kneeling nymphs did not understand at first what had happened. When Athena reached out and seized the upper edge of Arachne's weaving, that was not merely a hand touching cloth. It was as if the established order, unable to endure the mirror that exposed it, had thrown itself directly upon the reflection. That free border the young girl had framed with ivy tightened for a moment between the goddess's fingers. Then a sorrowful, dry sound of tearing rose from within the fibers. That sound carried more than the ripping of wool and labor. Europa's shore suddenly split open through the middle. The waves pulled apart from one another. The silent fall of the golden rain broke into scattered flashes, and the women's gazes were cut short. Athena was not only tearing the fabric apart, she wanted to silence the testimony carved into it as well. With every pull, she tried to make one part of the truth Arachne had built disappear. With every rip, she aimed to make the crimes of the gods impossible to tell again. When power wanted to defend itself, it usually struck not the word first, but the surface that carried that word. That was exactly what happened in the workshop at that moment. The work of art was being treated not as the work of a defeated rival, but as a text that had to be banned. At the first sound of tearing, Arachne stepped forward. Her shoulders tightened all at once, and an expression very different from her earlier silent victory settled over her face. This was not the ordinary pain of an artist who loved her work. She understood that what was being torn in Athena's hands was not only her own labor, but also the silenced voices of women and the delicate fabric of truth. She did not say, "Let it go," because she saw that this was not a moment of anger, but an act of deliberate destruction. Yet as her eyes moved back and forth between the goddess's hands and the cloth, the shock collapsing inside her spread through her body. As she had built that weaving loop by loop, she had made the real cold of the water on Europa's shore. Danae's upward-looking astonishment, Leda's unrest she could not name, and Antiope's honor live within the fabric. Now they were being torn apart piece by piece in the rage of a divine sentence. Arachne's hands stretched forward involuntarily, but that reach was not meant to attack. It was as instinctive and hopeless as someone trying to save a text already burning. As the embodied form of art was being destroyed before her, the young girl saw for the first time not her own defeat, but the public strangling of truth. Athena, meanwhile, was no longer inside the contest at all. Before her movements punished a rival, they had turned into the reflex of a power trying to reclaim ownership of the narrative. In the goddess's eyes, the torn weaving was not merely a work of art. It was dangerous evidence of unmanaged memory, an unchecked narrative, and an aesthetic intelligence that refused obedience. That was why the anger she felt as she split the fabric in two was far more systematic than wounded pride. Some rulers did not fear words, but they feared the endurance of words. Some silenced the page that carried a poet's voice before they ever killed the poet. Athena's hand worked in exactly that way in that workshop. It was as if, in the stone forums of empires not yet founded, a princeps would black out the lines of a poet who unsettled him, pushing the text to the edge of the earth and the writer beyond the center. So too the goddess attacked the work first. In such moments, censorship was born not with fire or decree, but with a sacred fury that said, "I cannot allow this to be seen." That was why Arachne's weaving was not merely torn. It was silenced like a text under judgment. The scream of the fabric spread beyond an ancient workshop, like the first echo of every poem and every exiled voice forced under pressure in ages to come. When Arachne finally tried to step between the loom and Athena, there was no room left for debate in the goddess's eyes. The shuttle in her hand, which had just moments before been a graceful tool in service of weaving, suddenly turned into the hard extension of her will. When Athena raised it, everyone in the workshop felt the air grow thin once again. The first blow did not throw Arachne to the ground, but the hardness that struck her forehead echoed like lightning crashing inward rather than outward. The young girl staggered, but she did not fall. For a moment her face lost its light, then gathered itself again. The goddess's second and third blows did not come like the blind flinging of rage, but like rhythmic and humiliating strikes that said, "Know your place." Athena did not want only to inflict pain upon her body. She wanted to break her mind and her courage as well. The shock rising through Arachne's forehead made it feel as though thought itself was being targeted, as if the goddess was striking directly at the head to silence that daring mind. The young girl retreated and caught the edge of the loom with one hand, but she did not avert her gaze. That was the most unbearable part of the attack. The body was being forced, yet the will still refused to bend. The kneeling nymphs did not dare to move. As the daughters of Pactolus looked at the strands of the weaving, which had seemed like real waves just moments before and were now lying torn underfoot, they watched in horror as a work of art was turned into evidence of a crime. The peasant women lowered their heads even further. In their eyes, Athena was still a goddess, but that morning they felt for the first time that what was divine and what was just were not the same thing. Eadmon, meanwhile, had gone rigid in the corner. His hands, stained with purple, rose once into the air and then simply fell again, because it was one thing to lunge forward with a father's reflex, and quite another to know what one was trying to interrupt in the face of divine power. When he looked at the blows falling upon his daughter's forehead, he did not see only a body being hurt. He felt that the order of labor built over years in that small house, the quiet discipline inherited from the mother, and every memory brought to life in the weaving were all being humiliated at the same time. Although the goddess seemed to be silencing a mortal girl, she was actually declaring, "No art that crosses this threshold will remain safe." The workshop was no longer a place of contest. It had turned into a narrow field of execution where power reminded the artist of her limit through the body. But the complete submission Athena wanted still did not come. Although Arachne carried the dizziness of the blows that had struck her forehead, she did not collapse into a break that pleaded with the goddess. As she stepped back after a series of shocks, a kind of painful clarity appeared on her face, as if the physical attack had made the heart of the argument even clearer. The issue was no longer who had woven better, or which scene had been more flawless. When truth had been shown and no flaw could be found in it, the way power behaved had been revealed in all its nakedness. First it had torn apart the work, then it had turned on the one who made it. First the text had been censored, then the writer had been punished. Even through pain, Arachne saw in every blow from the goddess that her own argument had been confirmed. The crime of the heavens was not only to deceive by changing form, but to resort to violence when exposed. That was why the young girl's gaze returned, even through her daze, with a strange clarity. As Athena tried to force her to the ground, she was actually adding one final confirmation to Arachne's weaving. With her own hands, the goddess was proving that censorship followed crime. The torn pieces of fabric lay scattered across the stone floor. The ivy leaves no longer looked like a whole frame, but like broken green sentences scattered here and there. Europa's shore had been left unfinished from one side, and Danae's chamber from the other, yet sometimes an image left incomplete spoke more than one destroyed entirely, because the gaze turned inward to complete what was missing, and there it felt the hidden meaning more sharply. Whether Athena understood that was unknown, but when she lowered the shuttle in her hand after the final blows, there was nothing like peace on her face, nothing that resembled victory. She had humiliated Arachne, torn apart her work, and brought fear back to everyone in the workshop. And still something remained that could not be erased. The shock left on the young girl's forehead spoke, but so did the silent insistence of the pieces on the floor. Power could tear a text apart, but the tearing itself became a new text. It could ban a poem, but that ban created a second echo around the poem. What happened that day in the narrow workshop of Hypaepa was the kind of fate that would be heard again centuries later in the lines of a poet sent into exile. The center first condemned the voice that held up a mirror to it, then suppressed it, and at last tried to cut off its circulation. When Arachne straightened again beside the loom, she was no longer the same girl from that morning. Her shoulders were still delicate, her face was still young, but in her gaze there was the cold resolve of a door that had closed. She looked at the shattered weaving before her. There she saw not her own defeat, but the reason art was so dangerous to power. Because art did not only create what was beautiful, in the right moment and not in the wrong hands, it also made the wrong order visible. That was why Athena could not endure her. What hung in the workshop at that moment was not only the smell of purple dye, wool dust, and the coolness of the morning. The heavy silence left behind by a shattered work had also sunk into the air. And inside that silence everyone heard for themselves the sentence that remained unspoken. When the argument ended and truth could not be taken back, power eventually spoke with its hands. After that final blow from Athena's hand, the silence left in the workshop was not just any silence. It carried neither the weary stillness of a finished fight, nor the first numb freeze of fear that left a person speechless. It was something heavier, more personal, more searing. The snapped threads of the shattered weaving on the floor, the scattered vines, and the half-finished faces lay around Arachne like silenced witnesses. The young woman had remained standing, yes, but in that moment the weight her body carried was not only the shock of the blows. What truly crushed her was that before her eyes, not only her labor, but her very name had been humiliated. By tearing apart the work, Athena had targeted not just a piece of cloth, but the order of truth Arachne had built. Then, by bringing the shuttle down on her forehead, she had shown that defiance would be punished not only in thought, but in the body as well. Under all the eyes in the workshop, Arachne saw not herself for a moment, but the small universe built around her collapsing. The poor house, the quiet discipline left by her dead mother, the long patience soaked into the scent of her father's purple dye, the labor that had lasted through countless nights, all of it seemed to have been torn from its place in a single instant of humiliation. That was why the darkness advancing inside the young woman was not the darkness of defeat, but the darkness of having her own story taken from her. Arachne did not cry then. Just as she did not fall to her knees and beg for forgiveness, she also did not pour out her anger with a shout. When some souls broke, they made noise. Others, by contrast, sank into a dangerous silence. Hers belonged to the second kind. She lifted her hand to her forehead for a brief moment, then slowly lowered it. As she stood before Athena, traces of pain marked her face, but something stronger than pain had taken hold there, a clarity hardening deep inside her. The young woman understood very well what was now being demanded of her, not only that she accept defeat, but that she also carry humiliation, not only that she be silent, but that she also accept being silenced as legitimate. In Athena's world, this was the only way out left to her. Yet it was precisely here, in the darkest moment of the blow and the shame, that Arachne's soul took its own shape one final time. Since childhood, she had built everything without borrowing anything. Not her color, not her gaze, not her art. Now she did not want to leave the final decision of her life to someone else's judgment either. This decision was neither a search for peace nor a calm surrender. It was more the need to turn back at the threshold of the door that was being shut and speak her own name one last time with her own voice. The soul's final rebellion was born exactly there. Those in the workshop did not understand this silent change in her at once. The nymphs still stood motionless under the spell of fear, while the village women, their eyes lowered to the ground, tried to judge whether the goddess's anger had faded or not. Idmon, however, was watching his daughter. A father's heart sensed before anyone else that disaster began in the eyes before it reached the body. What stood in Arachne's eyes then was not the fire of the challenge she had shown moments earlier, but a deeper certainty. The young woman moved slowly through the threads scattered across the floor. Each step seemed to complete a thought within her. When the snapped strands of the unfinished weaving touched the tips of her feet, she did not hesitate. Those strands no longer reminded her of loss, but of a truth that could not be taken back. Athena might have torn apart her art, but there was still one thing she had not managed to seize within the young woman, the bare right of the final choice. Arachne thought of this not like a victim, but like someone who did not want to let another person write the last sentence of her story. Because some humiliations did not only cause pain, they tried to turn a person into a supporting figure in her own story. Arachne would not accept that. If her name was going to live on, she was determined not to let it live only in the form Athena commanded. The place the young woman turned toward was one of the most familiar corners of the workshop. There stood the strong cords that had been used for years to tie wool, gather warp, and hang skeins, silent tools of daily labor, innocent objects woven into the everyday life of that house. When Arachne's hand reached for one of them, the simplicity of the movement made the air in the workshop feel even heavier. Because tragedies often became more searing, not through some foreign instrument, but through familiar things a person's hand had known for years. The young woman felt the fibers of the cord between her fingers. It was as though she sensed that weaving had come before her one last time, not as material, but as fate. Her soul was not shattered in that moment. On the contrary, it was held in a frightening focus. She knew very well what her act meant, but this movement did not appear like the dark fall of a helplessness that had surrendered. It appeared more like an effort to protect the only remaining space of judgment left after the honor taken from her. Arachne could no longer refuse the contest, rebuild the work, or erase Athena's blows. But at the very least, she could determine the road to her own end not by someone else's command, but by her own will. The fire in her soul had not gone out. It had only turned not outward anymore, but against fate itself. Idmon was the first to understand her intention. For a moment, he wanted to step forward, but his legs could not keep pace with his heart, because what he saw in his daughter's eyes was not an ordinary outburst. It was a decision too far advanced to be stopped with words. When he wanted to call out, "Arachne," her name knotted in his throat. The nymphs moved as well, but none of them dared come closer. Before the goddess, they feared that even touching the will of a mortal girl would mean crossing yet another boundary. Athena, meanwhile, stood where she was. There was no softness of mercy in her gaze. Rather, there was a cold attentiveness to how mortal souls carried their pride, even in their most extreme moments. That was why, in the workshop at that moment, not only Arachne's decision, but also the final silent negotiation between goddess and mortal hung in the air. When the young woman lifted her head, dawn had already turned to morning, yet the light gave her no peace. She looked at the ceiling beams, at the everyday objects hanging there, at the usual poor order of the house, and understood that none of it protected her anymore. A house remained a house only through its owner's honor. When that honor was shattered, the walls became nothing but stone and mud brick. That was why Arachne's decision had been an answer given less to life than to humiliation. Her hands did not tremble as she prepared the cord. That detail was what frightened the people in the workshop most, because sometimes the storm within a person looked, from the outside, like complete stillness. There was no romantic ecstasy on Arachne's face. She did not behave like someone turning herself into a legend, nor did she turn death into a beautiful idea. On the contrary, she carried the plain and hard seriousness of a human being bearing the weight of what she was doing. What had brought her to that threshold was not a world she found unworthy of life, but her inability to endure having her voice silenced by someone else's command. Her pride here was not empty arrogance. It was the final defense of the self built together by her labor, her art, and her memory. That was why her choice, though it might have looked like an ending to an outside eye, was for her own soul one final act of claiming herself. It was as though she was saying, "You cannot make me live with your humiliation. If you want to silence me, then I will choose the shape of my silence as well." That thought was as terrible as it was alive, because Arachne was acting not by collapsing and coming apart, but by drawing the boundary of her own will, even in the final moment. The fire of her soul had not gone out. It had only changed direction. At that moment, everyone in the workshop seemed cut off from the flow of time. The village women raised their hands to their mouths in fear. The water nymphs narrowed their eyes and remained caught between looking away and bearing witness. And Idmon felt that terror that came too late, the terror known by those who understood that rushing forward would no longer help. Arachne looked at Athena for a brief moment. This look neither begged for help nor carried a curse. It held more the clarity of saying, "You brought me here, but I am still taking the final step myself." She had refused to kneel before Athena. Now she was refusing to live a life of humiliation as well. As the young woman's body lifted slightly, the air in the workshop grew tense enough to seem almost ready to break. No one cried out loudly, and no one shattered the order with a scream, because what was happening looked so naked, so absolute, that making a sound might have seemed like a motion too late to catch up with it. In that moment, Arachne's story seemed for the first time to have passed completely into her own hands. Athena had accepted the contest. Athena had begun the violence. Athena had torn apart the weaving. But the will standing on the final threshold still belonged to the young woman herself. And yet at that threshold, another unseen power was also born. Because in myths, no great act of defiance ended with death alone. The gods sometimes gave souls that rose against them a longer form of punishment instead of destroying them. When the air inside the workshop changed all at once, the nymphs felt it first. The cords, the beams, the scattered fibers, and the shattered weaving suddenly ceased to be mere objects and became signs waiting for the decision that was drawing near. The same hardness still remained on Arachne's face, but now a divine coldness began to weave itself around that hardness. What replaced anger in Athena's gaze was a more chilling thought, not allowing a mortal girl to take herself away from her. Because death sometimes meant the end of punishment, divine power, however, often loved not the ending, but the prolonging of judgment. As Arachne tried to pull herself out of humiliation, another fate bent down over her at that very moment. This was neither the arrival of mercy nor the beginning of forgiveness. It was more the silent approach of a divine will that wanted to turn even the soul's final rebellion into a punishment of its own kind. And everyone in the workshop, though they did not yet know what was going to happen, felt that the story had now turned into a darkness longer than death. As Arachne's body prepared to carry out that final decision, the air inside the workshop suddenly grew heavy. Even the morning light seemed to pause at the narrow door and shrink back instead of entering. Idmund's house, scented with purple dye, had just trembled with the echoes of rage and shame, and now it sank into a silence that felt stranger and colder. The cord Arachne had chosen had ceased to be one of the most ordinary tools of daily labor and had stretched tight like the final sentence of her own story. But Athena had not intended to leave her even the right to complete that final sentence with her own hand. The goddess stepped forward. There was no mercy on her face, yet her naked anger had also withdrawn. In its place came something more chilling, a resolve to strip death of its power as an exit and turn it into punishment. In that moment, an invisible struggle arose between Arachne's body and Athena's command. Everyone in the workshop sensed, before a single word had been spoken, that the goddess had not granted the young woman life. On the contrary, she had prepared to turn her death into her own judgment. The single word that left Athena's lips was short, hard and irreversible. Pende, that is, hang. There was no deliverance inside that command. Instead, it held the cold justice of being pulled back from death and left suspended forever. Arachne's final choice had been an attempt to seal her own story with her own hand. Athena, by breaking that choice, had meant to take from her even the last echo of her will. The cord remained stretched tight, but the peace of an ending did not come. The young woman neither fell to the ground nor reached the silence she had expected. Instead, she was left hanging at that narrow threshold between life and extinction. That was the goddess's ironic mercy. While seeming to prevent the mortal's death, she prepared a fate for her that was longer, more humiliating, and more unforgettable. The village women stepped back in horror. The nymphs were too slow to turn away their eyes, and Idmund was the first to understand that his daughter had not been saved in that moment, but only condemned in another form. For some gifts are harsher than open punishment. They close a door and present that closing as grace. Then Athena extended her hand, and a dark potion, almost unseen, touched Arachne's hair and forehead. This was not some ordinary crushed herb or healer's salve. In the myths, it resembled that sorrowful mixture prepared from the herbs of Hecate, whose name was bound to the knowledge of night, crossroads, the dim paths of the moon, and enchanted plants. In the eyes of the ancient world, Hecate was the goddess of transformations and hidden potions that human daylight reason could not explain. What Athena used carried exactly that kind of touch, a medicine that offered no comfort, healed nothing, and only altered form in a way that could not be reversed. Arachne did not feel its contact as warmth or coolness. She sensed it more as though the boundaries her body had always known began to loosen quietly. It was as if the invisible order that held her together had started to come apart, thread by thread. Everyone in the workshop saw this from the outside as only a stillness, but for the young woman, that moment was when the body ceased to be the one country that still belonged to her. Her hair changed first. Those dark strands that had once fallen over her shoulder in the wind, or while she worked now, loosened and slipped downward as quietly as an autumn leaf. It did not look like open violence. It felt more like the familiar ornament of youth, gently abandoning her face. As that old frame around her features came apart with the falling hair, Arachne felt her own youth being unraveled before her eyes. Then a light but foreign drawing sensation began in her head. The place that had housed her thoughts did not merely seem to shrink, but to narrow as if it were being summoned into a different proportion. While the echo of the blows still lingered on her brow, that brow itself now began to move away from its old human measure. Her eyes did not grow larger, but the world around them widened in another way. The objects around her did not suddenly seem gigantic. Something stranger happened. Arachne herself slowly withdrew from that old human center. Athena's punishment had aimed not so much to tear the body apart as to deprive it of its human proportion. The transformation did not stop there. The lines descending from her shoulders grew lighter, and the familiar length of arms and legs that had once carried the reassuring shape of a human being seemed to draw back like something retreating from a dream. Her limbs did not vanish all at once. Instead, they quietly shortened, narrowed, and surrendered their old meaning, becoming signs of another order. In that moment, Arachne felt her body becoming alien to her, but that alienness carried not terror so much as a humiliating clarity. For Athena did not kill her, she unraveled her remaining humanity. The graceful fingers of Idmund's daughter, those fine and resolute hands that had guided the shuttle before the loom, now changed into the smaller marks of another skill, one given over to more added parts. As the young woman was forced to watch her own body being taken away from her, she still felt that the fire inside her spirit had not gone out. That contradiction made the transformation even more painful. Her body was shrinking, yet the will within her still refused to retreat. In this way, the punishment became not only physical, but symbolic. Where Athena could not break Arachne's honor, she set out to turn her form into another being fitted to her own hierarchy. As the witnesses in the workshop watched this change, they could not even decide by what word they should name what was happening. Some of the village women wanted to think of it as divine justice, but the upheaval rising inside them would not allow it. Even the Nymphs, beings who had heard many tales of metamorphosis before, fell silent before the irony inside this transformation. For Athena was not merely punishing here, she was also shaping meaning. Arachne's final rebellion had taken form in the act of hanging. The goddess turned that act into the law of her new existence forever. While the young woman had wanted to disappear into death, she was being transformed into the eternal form of suspension. That was where the true cruelty of the command Pende lay. This was not a rescue, but a politics that turned suicide itself into punishment. Arachne had wanted to choose the end of her own story. Athena imposed on her a form whose ending itself stretched into eternity. Thus the goddess's will, while preventing death, did not grant life. It only forced a model of existence that would repeat without end into the body itself. Yet as the transformation moved forward, a crack also began to appear within Athena's judgment, one she had left there without meaning to. Arachne's human body may have been disappearing, but her most defining quality, her gift for weaving, did not vanish. On the contrary, inside that shrinking frame, her old artistic instinct grew denser and moved toward another order. As human hands withdrew, the new fineness that took their place seemed ready to work, not with thread, but with lighter and more invisible strands. For that reason, the spirit within Arachne could not be counted as fully defeated despite all the humiliation. Athena diminished her bodily, cast her down socially, and stripped her of human visibility. Yet without realizing it, she also opened the door for her to continue her art in another form. The purple dust of the workshop, the ceiling beams, the light filtering through the crack of the door, and the scraps of weaving scattered across the stone floor were all preparing to become the first stage of this new being. Arachne might no longer be recognized by her old face, but the compulsion in her spirit to weave still remained. And sometimes the greatest failure of punishments is that they cannot erase the essence of the one they strike. As the transformation neared completion, Arachne was able to look inward one last time at her old life. Her mother's scent, her father's dye-stained hands, the damp steam of wool in the mornings of Hypaepa, the hard sound of the loom, the scenes she had worked like ivy leaves and sea foam. All of them passed through her at once like the last bright fragments of human memory. They came not with pain, but with a strange clarity, for she knew there would be no return. Athena's dark medicine, with that sorrowful touch that recalled the shadowed knowledge of Hecate, had finished its work. Even so, the young woman's last feeling was not a plea. Even against this new existence forced upon her, there was a hardness inside her that did not shrink. If her human form was to be taken away, the mastery she had learned within that form would not vanish with it. That was what would keep Athena's punishment from becoming a complete triumph. She could condemn Arachne to remain hanging, but she could not fully control what the one who hung would weave. As a new being prepared to emerge in the silence of the workshop, the spirit of the old girl still searched for its own work. When Athena stepped back, the torn scraps of weaving on the floor, the fate suspended in the air and the heavy silence settling over the narrow workshop had all become parts of the same scene. The goddess had given the young woman neither death, nor peace, nor forgiveness. She had given her a form of life that was longer, smaller, and seen from below. Yet inside that life, even if unwillingly, she had also imprisoned the inexhaustible artistic spark of Arachne. That was why the change that began with Hecate's herbs was not merely a chapter of punishment, it was also the dark threshold of another age of creation. Human beauty was gone, human proportion was broken, hair, head, limbs, and posture had been called into another shape. Yet the desire to weave was still there. Idmon could not fully understand it, but he felt it. The nymphs also waited with fearful attention, for what happened that day in the small house was not merely the punishment of a girl. Art, while seeming to be torn out of one body, was moving into another body in order to continue. And when everyone saw the first silent movement of this new being drawing itself toward the ceiling, they understood that the story had not ended. When the transformation was complete, the first thing felt in the workshop was not silence, but the sense that a movement left unfinished was still continuing. Athena's command had taken Arachne's human body from her, pulling her back from death and binding her to the cold law of endless suspension. Yet within that sentence a residue remained that the goddess had not foreseen. The young woman's spirit had not abandoned its old habit, even though her body had grown small. That new, light, unsettling form hanging near the ceiling might at first have looked pitiful, and yet Arachne's concentration had not scattered. While her torn weaving lay below on the floor, the new body that had taken its place above trembled like the old art translated into another language. It was at that exact moment that the most powerful word of the myth was born. And yet. That meant even if everything had been taken away, and yet, even if the human face had vanished, and yet, even if the work had been torn, the name humiliated, the body turned into another being, and yet. When Arachne released the first thread into the empty air from within that tiny body, she turned punishment not into an end but into a continuing act of will. That first thread had not been made of wool, linen, or costly strands, dyed with the purple of Phocaea, but neither had it been as innocent as any stitch ever born on Arachne's old loom. It was so fine that it was nearly invisible, and yet when the morning light touched it, it shone like a hard line edged in silver. The young woman had lost her hands now, but the order of her new legs had turned into another kind of shuttle. When she descended from the beam of the workshop into the open air, the movement did not look like the instinct of a small creature building shelter, but like the first attempt of a great master who had decided to continue her old art in a new material. Arachne looked down at the torn cloth below, the unfinished shore of Europa, the severed vines, the divided flowers lay silent on the stone floor. She, above them, began to spread her new surface with invisible fibers directly over that wreckage. For that reason, the first web was not merely a spider's web. It was the second copy of the story Athena had torn apart, raised into the air. Less showy to the human eye, but harder for the hand of power to seize. The words, "and yet," turned into thread that morning before they turned into Arachne's body. When the first few lines met one another, Idmon lifted his head and had to look at his daughter's new art. Until that moment, a spider's web had seemed to him like a fragile bit of disorder that gathered quietly in the corners of houses. Now, within that web, he saw a discipline he recognized. It was not the same as before. The colors were gone now. The great figures were gone. The faces exposing the gods were gone. Yet the essence of the old mastery had not disappeared. It had only withdrawn into an abstract geometry. Arachne had once built scenes. Now she wove lines without a center, opening in every direction, beginning at one point and finding their own logic at another. Each fiber joined the next with such precision that within something outwardly colorless, a hidden proportion, a silent rhythm, and an unerring architecture rose up. In answer to the hierarchy Athena had frozen on the Areopagus, there stood here a living, vibrating order. There was no single center above, nor any authority carrying command downward. The web built its own law from within itself, and that was where Arachne's metamorphic defiance lay. Her old weavings no longer continued in the form of figures, but in the structure itself. The nymphs in the workshop did not know at first what they were supposed to feel before this new art, because at first glance, the web was the clear sign of a punishment of diminishment, but when seen up close, it looked like a second victory rising from within a humiliated body. The water maidens of the Pactolus noticed how the threads caught the light. In Arachne's scene of Europa, the waves had made the viewer believe in real water. Now these fine fibers carried a deceptive clarity that confused the eye about where it was looking. For a moment they disappeared, then suddenly appeared in their full presence, and then blended back into the air again. The goddess's order had spoken through gold. Arachne's new art spoke through near-nothingness. Yet that nothingness was not weakness but a refined superiority, because the weaving no longer stood as great surfaces that could be seized, but was built like a trap working with light and emptiness. In that way, Arachne had not wholly lost her old realism, but had carried it to another level. Once, she had made the bull's hide feel real. Now, she could turn even invisibility into a material truth. For that reason, the web was not imitation, but a new form of verum, as fine as life itself, yet too concrete to deny when touched. As time passed, the web spread, and on the ceiling of the workshop there began to appear not only a nest, but the transparent continuation of the old art. Arachne's new body was small. Despite that, the order she built seemed broader and more persistent than what she had built when she was human. The girl who had once stood for hours at her loom now moved from ceiling to ceiling, linking fiber to fiber without leaving even the smallest gap empty. The hard corners of the beams, the shadowed spaces above the door, the unreachable meeting points of the walls had become new places of work for her. As the web multiplied, the workshop changed as well. The space that had been humiliated by Athena's blows was quietly being taken back by Arachne's new threads. When Idmon saw how the drops of morning dew shone upon the web, he remembered his daughter's old games of color. The purple was gone, the gold was gone, the figures had faded, but the delicate passage between light and shadow was still there. Technical perfection had changed form, but its essence had been preserved. Arachne was no longer telling the same stories, perhaps, but in every new line, she was writing a simpler, harsher, more stubborn sentence that said, "Art is not limited by the body." The true failure of Athena's punishment became visible there as well. The goddess had thought that by turning Arachne into a small creature, she had made her insignificant, yet the shrunken body had caused art to return in a more concentrated form. And this new art was harder to destroy than cloth that could be torn. A spider's web could be broken with a single blow, yes, but at the same time, it could also be rebuilt the next day with the same silence and the same patience. Arachne's defiance reached its brightest form precisely in that daily labor of repair. One part of the web broke, the wind scattered a fine line, or one of the movements within the house loosened a knot, but the young weaver began again every morning. That repetition did not look like an ordinary survival instinct. It looked far more like a refusal of Athena's torn weavings, turning perfection into a habit that was now harder to erase. Arachne repaired every broken place with such care that the break returned almost more balanced than it had been before. In that way, repair became her new field of mastery. She did not accept destruction. She turned it into the material of a new perfection. For that reason, Arachne's first web had to be counted not merely as a beginning, but as one of the quietest and most persistent declarations in the history of art. She could no longer speak with a human voice, weave great scenes, or place the crimes of the gods before us figure by figure. But she had gained another power that made up for that. Her art had ceased to be representation and had become a mode of existence. She was no longer simply one who wove. She had become a being who lived within the weaving itself and turned it into the necessary motion of her body. That was where the thing called the old art was born again. Antiquas tellers, that is, the old weavings, no longer continued as colorful narratives. They continued within an abstract order without a center, symmetrical, trembling, and beginning again from every corner. Against Athena's frozen authority, Arachne's web remained alive. It swayed with the wind, became visible in the light, and then faded again. That movement was the new counterpart to the whirl of scenes she had once built upon her loom. So the goddess had changed her body, but had not been able to destroy the logic of her art. The language of the threads had changed. The language of the will had not. As the days passed in the little house at Hypaepa, this web on the ceiling no longer looked like the remnant of a punishment, but like the sign of a new decree. Every time Idmon opened the door, he looked upward and saw the traces of his daughter's silent labor. When village women came into the house, they shuddered at first, then noticed the perfection of the lines shining in the light and fell silent. Even the nymphs felt not contempt, but attention before this new weaving. Because everyone was slowly forced to accept the same truth. Athena had not stopped Arachne, but had only forced her to continue her art in another material. And that material had proved, in an unexpected way, more resilient. Cloth could be torn, but webs were woven again. Great scenes could be censored, but invisible geometry rose again every morning. For that reason, Arachne's first web became not the monument of defeat, but the monument of transformed defiance. That tiny body hanging from the ceiling that morning could no longer speak openly to the world, and yet in every new thread, it kept saying the same thing. What had been taken was form, but what remained was essence. And the essence, and yet again without stopping, kept weaving. As the years passed in Lydia, the delicate webs hanging from the ceiling of that small house in Hypaepa no longer seemed like a trivial part of daily life. At first, people had told of Arachne's punishment as the cautionary end of a young girl who had gone too far against the gods. But as time passed, another current emerged within that telling. For the punishment itself was not forgotten, yet the persistence that rose out of that punishment was remembered just as strongly. Those webs, rebuilt every morning and repaired with the same care after every break, did not resemble only the survival habit of a small creature. They carried the echo of a torn weaving that refused to fall silent. As Idmon grew older, he lifted his head upward more often, and even though he could no longer see his daughter's former human face, he recognized her stubborn devotion to work anew each day. When the village women looked at the fine lines gleaming in the dark corners of the house, they shuddered, yet they could not easily turn their eyes away. For everyone, even if no one said it openly, had begun to sense the same truth. Athena had diminished Arachne, suspended her, and silenced her. But she had not made her give up weaving. This silent legacy did not remain within the borders of Lydia. Caravans passing along the slopes of Tmolos, stories told during the grape harvest festivals, and old tales carried from ear to ear in the marketplaces brought Arachne's name to other cities. Each storyteller changed the event in a different way. Some remembered her as a proud girl, some found her too bold against the gods, and some whispered that her real crime had been showing the truth too nakedly But no matter whose mouth the story came from, it always arrived at the same point. Arachne had been defeated, yet her defeat had not produced complete silence. That was why the story that reached the ears of Niobe, Queen of Thebes, became not only a tale of punishment, but also a sign of how thin the invisible boundary between gods and mortals truly was. And yet Niobe, while looking at the number of her children and the splendor of her lineage among the high stones of the Theban palace, did not read that sign as a real warning. Perhaps she counted Arachne's end as the danger of speaking against the gods, but she could not understand that her own pride was moving toward the same abyss by another road. In that way, Arachne's fate became for Niobe less a lesson than the first echo of the disaster drawing near. Niobe's error differed from Arachne's, but the same hard core lay hidden within them both. Arachne had risen to her feet by saying that her art belonged to no one, and she had directly questioned Athena's superiority. Niobe, by contrast, had set her own fertility, her abundance of children and her own splendor against divine motherhood. One had spoken at the Loom, the other on the steps of the palace. Yet in the voice of both, there had been that dangerous openness in which a mortal tried to measure herself against the heavens. That was why the web on the ceiling of Arachne's house began, years later, to seem like a small sign woven in advance of Niobe's fate of turning to stone. In Lydia, old women began telling young girls those two names together. One, the woman who angered the goddess with her weaving. The other, the woman who scorned the goddess because of the multitude of her children. Both had been punished. But what was truly remembered was not only their punishments. Their stories told that the gods demanded not only obedience from mortals, but also restraint. Even so, a second question always remained hidden within that telling. Was it truly arrogance that had been punished, or every human power bright enough to seem capable of rivaling the gods? Centuries later, when the dusty roads of Lydia connected to the stone streets of Rome, and from there to the cold order of emperors, Arachne's story gained a new meaning once again. This time, the one who heard it was not a palace, but a poet bearing the pain of exile, the Roman poet Ovid. This man, who gathered old myths and bound them together, turning the dark history of the gods full of transformations into poetry, did not see in Arachne only a hero of myth. For him, the young weaver was the sister of everyone who spoke through art, a truth that power did not like. Ovid had tasted in his own life how power first condemned the voice that disturbed it, then punished it, and finally pushed it away from the center. Because of that, the tearing of Arachne's weaving did not seem to him only like Athena's wrath. It also seemed like the mythological image of how imperial order looked upon poetry that troubled it. In the cold of exile, the poet sensed the bond between his own fate and Arachne's fate. One had shown with her loom what the gods had hidden, the other with his lines had made audible the cracks that power wished to conceal. Both had been silenced where no fault could be found. This hidden closeness felt by Ovid gave Arachne's story an invisible second life. He did not openly say, "I am Arachne." There was no need for that. But between the lines of his work, a thought moved. You could drive us away from the center, tear our work apart, darken our name. Even so, we would keep weaving in hidden corners. This told not only of poetry, but of the shared stubbornness of all creative spirits. A loom could be shattered, A poem could be made impossible to read aloud. An artist could be sent into exile. But art often found form again in the most unseen places. That was why the web on Arachne's ceiling and Ovid's lines in Exile carried the same kinship. One wove fine strands in the dark corner of a house, visible only by the light. The other, far from the center of the empire, built invisible webs of poetry in his own solitude. The answer of both was bound to the same truth. Censorship destroyed only the surface. The real will returned in another substance. In that way, Arachne became the silent ancestor of a larger artistic lineage stretching from Lydia to Rome. What she wove was no longer only a web, but the enduring form of suppressed expression. As time moved forward still further, people continued not only to recoil from the spider, but also to learn from it. Women and men who looked at the webs gleaming in the dark corners of their homes first began to wonder how those webs were made. The lines spreading from the center to the edge, then the fine connections opening between those lines, the main strands that bore the weight, and the side fibers that balanced the vibration no longer seemed to the human eye like the random work of nature alone. So, a thought slowly took root. The art of weaving was not only the invention of humankind. Humanity had received one of its oldest teachers from the small spider hanging on the ceiling. Of course, looms, fabrics, colors, and patterns belonged to another world. But the patience that built the web, the stubbornness that bound the broken parts again, and that silent geometry that turned emptiness into order, continued to live in Arachne's new form. Because of that, her curse gradually turned into a paradoxical legacy. The goddess had wished to diminish her. Humanity, however, began to see an unending mastery in that diminished body. In that way, over the centuries, punishment turned into an art that taught. The humiliated form became instructive. The strongest part of this ancient rebellion was not that it escaped forgetting, but that it became ordinary. People carved great disasters into monuments, turned heroes into songs, and preserved the names of kings in marble. But the spider's web lived every day before human eyes, and still remained only partly seen. That was why Arachne's legacy remained so stubborn. She was remembered not on the walls of great temples, but at the edges of homes, on the beams of barns, on the stone rims of wells, and in the silence of abandoned rooms. Each web stood not like a great declaration hung at the center of the world, but like a hidden text that revealed itself only to the careful eye. When a child saw the strands turning silver in the morning light, that child looked, without knowing it, upon Arachne's resistance. When a woman noticed that the web she had swept away had been built again the next day, she witnessed, without intending to, Arachne's stubbornness. In that way, Arachne's story lived on not only through tales, but also through recurring images. For those who knew her, those webs said that art had not died despite divine punishment. For those who did not know, there still remained there an unexplainable beauty of labor that filled the human heart with a strange respect and a slight unease. That was why the thing called the weaver's curse did not remain only a curse in the end. Yes, Arachne had been humiliated, diminished, torn away from the human body, and condemned to an endless suspended existence. But at the same time, she had gained a continuity that no other artist possessed. Her fabrics could be torn. Her webs, however, were built again every morning. Her name could be defamed, yet it was spoken again in every fine line of every web. The gods had pulled her downward, but people slowly learned something from her. Thus, the true ending of the story was found not in Athena's judgment, but in Arachne's endless repetition. What was carried from Lydia to Rome, and from Rome into the future, was the knowledge of that repetition. Even if an artist was silenced, that artist returned by changing form. Even if truth was suppressed, it found new fibers in hidden corners. Even if the weaving was torn, the hand began to weave again in another body. That is why even today, anyone who looked carefully at a spider's web shining in the morning light, whether they realized it or not, saw that a very old sentence still endured. Power could punish, but it could not completely destroy the will to create. When years passed, most people remembered not Athena's wrath, but that delicate web shining in the morning light. Because even great punishments grew old with time, but some images never grew old. In a dark corner of the small house in Hypaepa, in a moment when it seemed to think no one was looking, that web appeared like silver and quietly told the world this: breaking something did not truly mean ending it. Arachne's body had been made smaller, her voice had been silenced, and her labor had been humiliated. Yet one thing had remained that could not be taken from her: the desire to turn truth into form. In time, that was what people understood most of all. Gods changed, kings changed, laws changed, and even the names of fears changed. But the struggle between the power that wanted to hide the truth and the human being who tried to show it never changed. That was why Arachne's story did not remain an old tale. Because every age built its own loom. One age wove with wool, one age wrote in marble, one age printed on paper, and one age reflected itself on a screen. But in all of them, the same question remained in the air. Was what was beautiful truly what was right, or was it only what was meant to appear right? Athena's weaving had been flawless. It had been orderly, magnificent, and reassuring. But Arachne's weaving had left not peace but discomfort inside a person, because there the shadow beneath the shining surface could be seen. Even today, the world often offered us stories that were smooth, clean, and polished. Who should speak? Who should remain silent? Which pain was acceptable? Which objection was excessive? Which truth was considered too harsh? All of those things still were being determined by someone who wanted to control them. That was why Arachne was not as distant a name as we thought. Perhaps what made her unforgettable was not that she had won, but that she had not ended even after she had been defeated. Because sometimes a person showed who they were most clearly in the very place where they had fallen the hardest. Not while they were being applauded, but when they were left alone. Not while they were safe, but when they had lost. That was why Arachne's web had not been only a web. It had been the form of honor rebuilt after being broken. Someone could suppress a word, remove an image, make a book invisible, or push a person outside the crowd. But if that desire inside a person to build, to bind, and to complete was still alive, then the world would begin again in some corner. Sometimes in a tiny sentence, sometimes in the work of an unknown artist, and sometimes in a detail that everyone considered unimportant. The most stubborn things often lived in the most invisible places. Perhaps that was also the part of this story that made people think the most. Not everyone had to be Arachne, but one day everyone found themselves caught between Athena's weaving and Arachne's weaving. That meant between the reassuring official surface and the honest surface that disturbed the human heart. Between the word that protected order and the word that revealed the truth. And most of the time, a person's character showed itself exactly there. Because some things sounded pleasing but were empty inside, while some things were unsettling but true. The age we lived in had been like that too. There had been many images, many voices, many stories, but truth had often been hidden, not in the brightest place, but in the place where it was suppressed the most. That was why when a person looked at something today, the thing they needed to ask themselves was not only, was this beautiful? Sometimes the harder question was this: what did this want me not to see? The trace Arachne left behind deepened exactly there. She did not teach people grand words. She only reminded them of one small but heavy thing. Even if everything was taken from you one day, what mattered was what kind of person remained. Your voice could be lowered, but beside whom did your gaze stand? Your work could be diminished, but what did your hand refuse to stop making? Sometimes a person could not change the world, but they also did not have to agree to let the world change them completely. That delicate order Arachne had built on the ceiling lived on for that reason, not like a monument of victory, but like a mark of character. It had been fragile, easy to disturb, and never looked grand in anyone's eyes, but the next morning, it was still there. Perhaps human dignity was a little like that too. Not showy, but persistent. And that was why when the morning sun struck a spider web, a person saw not only nature, but also themselves. There was fragility there, but no weakness. There was silence there, but no surrender. There was a body that had been made smaller, but also a will that had not gone out. Perhaps that was exactly why Arachne's story never truly ended. Because even if the world changed, in every age some people would still try to separate the truth from beautiful-looking lies. In every age some people would pay the price for it, and in every age in some corner someone would still go on weaving. Sometimes no one would see it. Sometimes those who saw it would not understand it. But once the light struck from the right angle, those fine threads would appear again. Then a person understood. Some things endured not by shouting, but by enduring. I hope that as you end your day, this ancient epic has been a good story for you. I look forward to your comments and requests. Do not forget to follow my channel. May the darkness of the night and the rhythm of the sea bring you peace. Until we meet again in another legend, in the breath of another hero, love.